All right, time for part 9.
Own only what you can always carry with you. No languages, no countries, no people. Let your memory be your travel bag. Use your memory. Use your memory. It is those bitter seeds alone which might sprout and grow some day. Look around you. There are people around you. Maybe you will remember one of them all your life and later eat your heart out because you didn't make use of the opportunity to ask him questions. And the less you talk, the more you'll hear. Thin strands of human lives stretch from island to island of the archipelago. They intertwine, touch one another for one night only in just such a clickety-clacking half-dark car as this, and then separate once and for all. Put your ear to their quiet humming and the steady clickety-clack beneath the car. After all, it is the spinning wheel of life that is clicking and clacking away there. What strange stories you can hear, what things you will laugh at. Now, that fast-moving little Frenchman over there near the grating, why does he keep twisting around? What is he so surprised at? Explain things to him, and you can ask him at the same time how he happened to land here. So you've found someone who knows French, and you learn that he is Max Santerre, a French soldier, and he used to be just as alert and curious out in freedom in his douce France. They told him politely to stop hanging around the transit point for Russian repatriates, but he kept doing it anyway. And then the Russians invited him to have a drink with them, and from a certain moment after that he remembers nothing. He came to on the floor of an airplane to find himself dressed in a Red Army man's field shirt and breeches, with the boots of a convoy guard looming over him. They told him he was sentenced to 10 years in camp, but that, of course, as he very clearly understood, was just a nasty joke, wasn't it? And everything would be cleared up. Oh, yes, it will be cleared up, dear fellow. Just wait. Ahead of him lay another sentence for 25 years that he was given in camp, and he would not get out of Exile until 1957. Well, there was nothing to be surprised at in such cases in 1945 to 1946. That particular story was Franco-Russian, and here is one which is Russo-French. But no, really just pure Russian, because no one but a Russian would play this kind of trick. Throughout our history, there have been people who just couldn't be contained, like Menshikov in Berezovo in Surikov's painting. Now, take Ivan Kovrchenko, average height, wiry, and yet he couldn't be contained either, because he was a stalwart fellow with a healthy countenance, but the devil threw in a bit of vodka for good measure. He would talk about himself quite willingly and laugh at himself, too. Such stories as his are a treasure. They are meant to be heard. True, it took a long time to figure out why he had been arrested and why he was considered a political. But there's no real need to make a fetish of the category political either. Does it matter a damn what rake they haul you in with? As everyone knows very well, the Germans were preparing for chemical warfare, and we weren't. Therefore, it was most unfortunate that because of some dunderheads in the quartermaster's department, we left whole stacks of mustard gas bombs at a certain airdrome when we fled the Kuban, and the Germans could have turned this fact into an international scandal. At that point, Senior Lieutenant Koverchenko, a native of Krasnodar, was assigned 20 parachutists and dropped behind the German lines to bury all those invidious bombs. Those hearing this story have already guessed how it ends and are yawning. Next, he was taken prisoner, and he has now become a traitor of the motherland. Nothing at all like that. Koverchenko carried out his assignment brilliantly and returned through the front with his entire complement of men, having lost not one, and was nominated to receive the Order of Hero of the Soviet Union. But it takes a month or two for the official nomination to be confirmed, and what if you can't be contained within that Hero of the Soviet Union either? Heroes are awarded to quiet boys who are models of military and political preparedness. But what if your soul is afire and you want to drink, and there isn't anything to drink? And why, if you're a hero of the whole Union, are the rats being so stingy as to refuse you an extra liter of vodka? And Ivan Koverchenko mounted his horse, and even though it's true that he had never heard of Caligula, he rode his horse upstairs to the second floor to see the city's military commissar, the commandant. Come on now, issue me some vodka. He figured this would be more imposing, more in the style of a hero, and harder to turn down. Did they arrest him for that? No, of course not. But his award was reduced from hero to the Order of the Red Banner. Kovalchenko had a large thirst, and vodka wasn't always available, and so he had to be inventive. In Poland, he had gone in and prevented the Germans from blowing up a certain bridge. And he got the feeling this bridge really belonged to him, and so, for the time being, before our commandant's headquarters arrived, he exacted payment from the Poles for crossing the bridge. After all, without me you wouldn't have this bridge, you pests. He collected tolls for a whole day, for vodka, and then got bored with it, and this wasn't in any case the place for him to stick around. So, Captain Kovalchenko offered the nearby Poles his equitable solution, that they buy the bridge from him. Was he arrested for this? No. He didn't ask very much for it, but the Poles protested and refused. Pan Captain abandoned the bridge. All right then, to hell with you, take your bridge and cross it for nothing. In 1949, he was chief of staff of a parachute regiment in Polotsk. Major Kovalchenko was very much disliked by the political branch of the division because he had failed the political indoctrination course. He had once asked them to recommend him for admission to the military academy, but when they gave him the recommendation, he took one look at it and threw it back across the table at them. With that kind of recommendation, the place for me to go is not the academy, but to the Banderovtsi, the Ukrainian nationalist rebels. Was he arrested for that? He might very well have gotten a tenner for it, but he got away with it. At that point, on top of all the rest, it turned out that he had given one of his men an unwarranted leave, and then he himself drove a truck at breakneck speed while drunk and wrecked it. And so they gave him 10 days in the guardhouse. However, his own men, who loved him with absolute devotion, were the guards, and they let him out of the guardhouse to go and have fun in the village. So he could have been patient through that guardhouse stretch too. But the political branch began to threaten him with a trial. Now that threat shocked and insulted Kovalchenko. It meant, for burying bombs, Ivan, we need you. But for a lousy 1.5-ton truck, off to prison with you. He crawled out the window at night, went over to the Dvina River, where a friend's motorboat was hidden, and off he went in it. And it turned out that he wasn't just one more drunk with a short memory. He wanted to avenge himself for everything the political branch had done to him. And in Lithuania he left his boat and went to the Lithuanians, saying, "Brothers, take me to your partisans, accept me, and you won't be sorry. We'll twist their tails." But the Lithuanians decided he was being planted on them. Ivan had a letter of credit sewn in his clothes. He got a ticket to the Kuban. However, en route to Moscow, he got very drunk in a restaurant. Consequently, he squinched up his eyes at Moscow as they were leaving the station and told the taxi driver, "Take me to an embassy." "Which one?" "Who the hell cares? Anyone." And the driver took him to one. "Which one is that?" "The French." "All right." Perhaps his thoughts got mixed up, and his original intentions in going to an embassy had changed into something else. But his cleverness and his strength had in no wise lapsed. Without alerting the policemen at the embassy entrance, he went quietly down a side street and climbed to the top of a smooth wall double a man's height. In the embassy yard it was easier. No one discovered him or detained him, and he went on inside, walked through one room, then another, and he saw a table set. There were many things on the table, but what astonished him most was the pears. He felt a yen for them, and he stuffed all the pockets in his field jacket and trousers with them. At that moment, the members of the household came in to dine. Kovalchenko began to attack them and shout at them before they could begin on him. "You Frenchmen!" According to him, France hadn't done anything good for the last century. "Why don't you start a revolution? Why are you trying to get de Gaulle into power? And you want us to send our Kuban wheat to you? It's no go." "Who are you? Where did you come from?" The French were astounded. Immediately adopting the right approach, Kovalchenko kept his wits about him. "A major of the MGB." The French were frightened. "But even so, you are not supposed to burst in here. What is your business here?" "Blank you in the mouth," Kovalchenko bellowed at them straight from the heart. And after playing the hoodlum for them a while longer, He noticed that in the next room they were already telephoning about him. He was still sober enough to begin his retreat, but the pears started to fall out of his pockets, and he was pursued by mocking laughter. And in actual fact he had enough strength left not only to leave the embassy safe and sound, but to move on. The next morning he woke up in Kiev station. Was he not planning to go on to the West Ukraine? And they soon picked him up there. During his interrogation he was beaten by Abakumov personally, and the scars on his back swelled up to a hand's breadth. The minister beat him, of course, not because of the pears, and not because of his valid rebuke to the French, but to find out by whom and when he had been recruited. And, of course, the prison term they handed him was 25 years. There are many such stories, but like every railroad car, the Stolypin falls silent at night. At night there won't be any fish, nor water, nor going to the toilet. And the car is filled then with the steady noise of the wheels, which doesn't in the least break the silence. And if, in addition, the convoy guard has left the corridor, one can talk quietly from the third compartment for men with the fourth, or women's, compartment. A conversation with a woman in prison is quite special. There is something noble about it, even if one talks only about articles of the code and prison terms. One such conversation went on all night long, and here are the circumstances in which it took place. It was in July 1950. There were no passengers in the women's compartment, except for one young girl, the daughter of a Moscow doctor, sentenced under Article 5810. And there was a big to-do in the men's compartment. The convoy guards began to drive all the Zeks out of 3 compartments into 2, and don't even ask how many they piled up in there. And they brought in some offender who was not at all like a convict. In the first place, he hadn't had his head shaved, and his wavy blonde locks, real curls, lay seductively on his big, thoroughbred head. He was young, dignified, and dressed in a British military uniform. He was escorted through the corridor with an air of deference. The convoy itself had been a little awed by the instructions on the envelope containing his case file. And the girl had managed to catch a glimpse of the whole episode, but he himself had not seen her, and how much he regretted that later. From the noise and the commotion, she realized that the compartment next to hers had been emptied for him. It was obvious that he was not supposed to communicate with anyone. All the more reason for her to want to talk with him. It wasn't possible in the Stolypin to see from one compartment into another, but when everything was still, you could hear between them. Late at night, when things had begun to quiet down, the girl sat on the edge of her bunk, right up against the grating, and called to him quietly. And perhaps she first sang softly. The convoy guard was supposed to punish her for all this, but the guard itself had settled down for the night, and there was no one in the corridor. The stranger heard her, and, following her instructions, sat in the same position. They were now sitting with their backs to each other, braced against the same 1-inch partition, and speaking quietly through the grating at the outer edge of the partition. Their heads were as close as if their lips were kissing, but they could neither touch one another nor see each other. Erik Arvid Andersen understood Russian tolerably well by this time, made many mistakes when he spoke it, but in the end could succeed in communicating his thoughts. He told the girl his astonishing story, and we, too, will hear about it at the Transit Prison Center. She, in turn, told him the simple story of a Moscow student who had gotten 5810. But Arvid was fascinated. He asked her about Soviet youth and about Soviet life, and what he heard was not at all what he had learned earlier in leftist Western newspapers and from his own official visit here. They talked all night long, and that night everything came together for Arvid, the strange prisoner's car in an alien country, the rhythmic night-time clicking of the wheels, which always finds an echo in our hearts, and the girl's melodic voice, her whispers, her breath reaching his ear, his very ear, yet he couldn't even look at her. And for a year and a half he hadn't heard a woman's voice. And for the first time, through that invisible, and probably, and of course, necessarily beautiful girl, he began to see the real Russia and the voice of Russia told him the truth all night long. One can learn about a country for the first time this way, too. And in the morning he would glimpse Russia's dark, straw-thatched roofs through the window to the sad whispering of his hidden guide. Yes, indeed, all this is Russia. The prisoners on the tracks refusing to voice their complaints, the girl on the other side of the Stolypin partition, the convoy going off to sleep, pears falling out of pockets, buried bombs, and a horse climbing to the second floor. "The gendarmes! The gendarmes!" the prisoners cried out happily. They were happy that they would be escorted the rest of the way by the attentive gendarmes and not by the convoy. Once again I have forgotten to insert quotation marks. That was Korolenko who was telling us this. V.G. Korolenko, A History of My Contemporary, Moscow, 1955, Volume 3, page 166. We, it is true, were not happy to see the Blue Caps, but anyone who ever got caught in what the prisoners christened the pendulum would have been glad to see even them. An ordinary passenger might have a difficult time boarding a train at a small way station, but not getting off. Toss your things out and jump off. This was not the case with a prisoner, however. If the local prison guard or police didn't come for him or was late by even 2 minutes, toot-toot, the whistle would blow, and the train would get underway, and they would take the poor sinner of a prisoner all the way to the next transit point. And it was all right if it was actually a transit point that they took you to, because they would begin to feed you again there. But sometimes it was all the way to the end of the Stolypin's route, and then they would keep you for 18 hours in an empty car and take you back with a whole new group of prisoners. And then once again, maybe they wouldn't come for you, and once again you'd be in a blind alley, and once again you'd wait there, and during all that time they wouldn't feed you. Your rations, after all, were issued only until your first stop, and the accounting office isn't to blame that the prison messed things up, for you are, after all, listed for Toulon, and the convoy isn't responsible for feeding you out of its own rations, so they swing you back and forth 6 times. It has actually happened. Irkutsk to Krasnoyarsk, Krasnoyarsk to Irkutsk, Irkutsk to Krasnoyarsk, etc., 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 and when you do see a blue visor on the Toulon platform, you are ready to throw your arms around him. Thank you, beloved, for saving me. You get so worn down, so choked, so shattered in a Stolypin, even in 2 days' time, that before you get to a big city, you yourself don't know whether you would rather keep going in torment just to get there sooner, or whether you'd rather be put in a transit prison to recover a little. But the convoy guards begin to hustle and bustle. They come out with their overcoats on and knock their gun stocks on the floor. That means they're going to unload the whole car. First, the convoy forms up in a circle at the car steps, and no sooner have you dropped, fallen, tumbled down them, than the guards shout at you deafeningly in unison from all sides, as they have been taught. "Sit down, sit down, sit down!" This is very effective when several voices are shouting it at once, and they don't let you raise your eyes. It's like being under shell fire, and involuntarily you squirm, hurry, and where is there for you to hurry to? Crouch close to the ground and sit down, having caught up with those who disembarked earlier. Sit down is a very clear command, but if you are a new prisoner, you don't yet understand it. When I heard this command on the switching tracks in Ivanovo, I ran, clutching my suitcase in my arms. If a suitcase has been manufactured out in freedom and not in camp, its handle always breaks off, and always at a difficult moment, and set it down on end on the ground, and without looking around to see how the first prisoners were sitting, sat down on the suitcase. After all, to sit down right on the ties, on the dark, oily sand, in my officer's coat, which was not yet so very dirty, and which still had uncut flaps. The chief of the convoy, a ruddy mug, a good Russian face, broke into a run, and I hadn't managed to grasp what he wanted and why until I saw that he meant clearly to plant his sacred boot in my cursed back, but something restrained him. However, he didn't spare his polished toe and kicked the suitcase and smashed in the top. "Sit down!" he gritted, by way of explanation. Only at that point did it dawn on me that I towered over the surrounding zeks, and without even having the chance to ask, "How am I supposed to sit down?" I already understood how, and sat down in my precious coat, like everybody else, just as dogs sit at gates and cats at doors. I still have that suitcase, and even now, when I chance to come upon it, I run my fingers around the hole torn in it. It is a wound which cannot heal, as wounds heal on bodies or on hearts. Things have longer memories than people. And forcing prisoners to sit down was also a calculated maneuver. If you were sitting on your rear end on the ground, so that your knees tower in front of you, then your center of gravity is well back of your legs, and it is difficult to get up and impossible to jump up. And more than that, they would make us sit as tightly massed together as possible, so that we'd be in each other's way. And if all of us wanted to attack the convoy together, they would have mowed us down before we got moving. They had us sitting there to wait for the Black Maria. It transports the prisoners in batches. You couldn't get them all in at once. Or else to be herded off on foot. They would try to sit us down someplace hidden so that fewer free people would see us. But at times they did make the prisoners sit right there, awkwardly on the platform or in an open square. That is how it was in Kuibyshev. And it is a difficult experience for the free people. We stare at them quite freely and openly with a totally sincere gaze. But how are they supposed to look at us? With hatred? Their consciences don't permit it. After all, only the Yermilovs believe that people were imprisoned for cause. With sympathy? With pity? Be careful. Someone will take down your name and they'll set you up for a prison term, too. It's that simple. And our proud, free citizens, as in Mayakovsky, read it, envy me, I am a citizen, drop their guilty heads and try not to see us at all, as if the place were empty. The old women are bolder than the rest. You couldn't turn them bad. They believe in God, and they would break off a piece of bread from their meager loaf and throw it to us. And old camp hands,
That's cool.
non-political offenders, of course, weren't afraid either. All camp veterans knew the saying, whoever hasn't been there yet will get there, and whoever was there won't forget it. And look, they'd toss over a pack of cigarettes, hoping that someone might do the same for them during their next term. And the old woman's bread wouldn't quite carry far enough, what with her weak arm, and it would fall short, whereas the pack of cigarettes would arch through the air right into our midst, and the convoy guards would immediately work the bolts of their rifles, pointing them at the old woman, at kindness, at the bread. Come on, old woman, run along. And the holy bread, broken in two, was left to lie in the dust while we were driven off. In general, those minutes of sitting on the ground there at the station were among our very best. I remember that in Omsk we were made to sit down on the railroad ties between two long freight trains. No one from outside entered this alleyway. In all probability they had stationed a soldier at either end. You can't go in there. And even in freedom our people are taught to take orders from anyone in a uniform. It began to grow dark. It was August. The oily station gravel hadn't yet completely cooled off from the sun and warmed us where we sat. We couldn't see the station, but it was very close by, somewhere behind the trains. A phonograph blared dance music, and the crowd buzzed in unison. And for some reason it didn't seem humiliating to sit on the ground in a crowded, dirty mass in some kind of pen. And it wasn't a mockery to hear the dances of young strangers, dances we would never dance. To picture someone on the station platform meeting someone or seeing someone off, maybe even with flowers. It was 20 minutes of near freedom. The twilight deepened, the first stars began to shine. There were red and green lights along the tracks, and the music kept playing. Life was going on without us, and we didn't even mind any more. Cherish such moments, and prison will become easier to bear. Otherwise you will explode from rage. And if it was dangerous to herd the Zeks along to the Black Maria because there were streets and people right next to them, then the convoy statutes provided another good command. Link arms. There was nothing humiliating in this. Link arms, old men and boys, girls and old women, healthy people and cripples. If one of your hands is hanging onto your belongings, your neighbor puts his arm under that arm, and you in turn link your other arm with your other neighbor's. So you have now been compressed twice as tightly as in ordinary formation, and you have immediately become heavier and are hampered by being thrown out of balance by your belongings and by your awkwardness with them, and you sway steadily as you limp. Dirty, grey, clumsy creatures, you move ahead like blind men with an ostensible tenderness for one another, a caricature of humanity. It may well be that no Black Maria at all is there to fetch you, and the chief of convoy is perhaps a coward. He is afraid he will fail to deliver you safely, and in this state, weighed down, jouncing as you go, knocking into things, you trudge all the way through the city to the prison itself. There is one more command, which is a caricature of geese. Take hold of your heels! This meant that anyone whose hands were free had to grab both his legs at about ankle height. And now, forward march! Well now, reader, put this book aside. Try going around the room that way. How does it work, and at what speed? How much looking around could you do? And what about escaping? Picture the way 3 or 4 dozen such geese look from the side. Kiev, 1940. And it is not necessarily August out. It might be December, 1946, and there being no Black Maria, you are being herded at 40 degrees below zero to the Petropavlovsk transit prison, and it is easy to guess that during the last hours before arriving, the Stolypin convoy refused to go to the trouble of taking you to the toilet, so as to avoid getting it dirty. Weakened from interrogation, gripped by the cold, you have a very hard time holding it, women especially. This book is continued on Cassette 8, Side 1. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1, Section 2, continued. Cassette 8, Side 1. Weakened from interrogation, gripped by the cold, you have a very hard time holding it, women especially. Well, and so what? It's for horses to stand stock still and loose the floodgates. It's for dogs to go lift a leg against a fence. But as for people, you can do it right there while you keep moving. No need to be shy in your own fatherland. It will dry at the transit prison. Vera Konyeva stooped down to adjust her shoe and fell one step behind, and the convoy immediately set the police dog on her, and the dog bit her in the buttocks through all her winter clothing. Don't fall behind! And an Uzbek fell down, and they beat him with their gunstocks and jackboots. Well, that's no tragedy. It won't be photographed for the Daily Express. And the chief of convoy will live to a ripe old age and never be tried by anyone. And the Black Marias, too, came down to us from history. In what respect does the prison carriage described by Balzac differ from a Black Maria? Only that the prison carriage was drawn along more slowly, and prisoners weren't packed so tightly. True, in the 20s, columns of prisoners were still being driven afoot through our cities, even Leningrad. They brought traffic to a halt at intersections. So you got caught stealing, came the reproaches from the sidewalks. No one had yet grasped the great plan for sewage disposal. But, always alert to technological trends, the archipelago lost no time in adopting the Black Ravens, more familiarly known simply as Ravens, Black Marias. These first Black Marias appeared at the same time as the very first trucks on our still cobblestoned streets. Their suspension was poor, and it was very rough riding in them, but then the prisoners weren't made of crystal either. On the other hand, they were very tightly corked, even at that time in 1927. There wasn't one little crack, and there wasn't one little electric light bulb, and there wasn't any air to breathe, and it was impossible to see out. And even in those days, they stood so tightly packed inside that there wasn't any room left at all. And it wasn't that all this was intentionally planned. There simply weren't enough wheels to go around. For many years, the Black Marias were steel grey and had, so to speak, prison written all over them. But in the biggest cities after the war, they had second thoughts and decided to paint them bright colors and to write on the outside, bread. The prisoners were the bread of construction. Or meat. It would have been more accurate to write bones. Or even simply, drink Soviet champagne. Inside, the Black Marias might consist of a simple armored body or shell, an empty enclosure. Or perhaps there were benches against the walls all the way round. This was in no sense a convenience, but the reverse. They would push in just as many prisoners as could be inserted standing up. But in this case, they would be piled on top of each other like baggage, one bale on another. The Black Maria might also have a box in the rear, a narrow steel closet for one prisoner. Or it might be boxed throughout, single closets that locked like cells along the right and left-hand walls, with a corridor in the middle for the turnkey. One was hardly likely to imagine that interior like a honeycomb when looking at that laughing maiden on the outside. Drink Soviet champagne. They drive you into the Black Marias to the tune of the same shouts coming from the convoy from all sides at once. Come on there, get a move on quick. And so that you shouldn't have time to look around and figure out how to escape, you're shoved and pushed so that you and your bag get stuck in a narrow little door, and you knock your head against the lintel. The steel rear door slams shut with a bang, and off you go. It was rare, of course, to spend hours in a Black Maria. 20 to 30 minutes were more likely. But you got flung around. It was a bone breaker. It crushed all your insides during those half hours. Your head stooped if you were tall, and you remembered the cozy Stolypin with longing. And the Black Maria means one thing further. It is a reshuffling of the deck, new encounters, and among them those which stand out most clearly are, of course, your encounters with the thieves. You may never happen to be in the same compartment with them, and maybe they won't put you in the same cell with them, even at the transit prison. But here in the Black Maria, you are in their hands. Sometimes it is so crowded that even the thieves, the urki, find it awkward to filch. Your legs and your arms are clamped between your neighbors' bodies and bags as tightly as if they were in stocks. Only when all of you are tossed up and down and all your insides are shaken up by ruts and bumps can you change the position of your legs and arms. Sometimes, in less crowded circumstances, the thieves can check out the contents of all the bags in just half an hour and appropriate all the bacilli, the fats and goodies, and the best of the trash, the clothing. Cowardly and sensible considerations most likely restrain you from putting up a fight against them, and crumb by crumb you are already beginning to lose your immortal soul, still supposing that the main enemies and the main issues lie somewhere ahead, and that you must save yourself for them. And you might just throw a punch at them once and get a knife in the ribs then and there. There would be no investigation, and even if there should be one, it wouldn't threaten the thieves in any way. They would only be delayed at the transit prison instead of going to the far-off camp. You must concede that in a fight between a socially friendly prisoner and a socially hostile prisoner, the state simply could not be on the side of the latter. In 1946, retired Colonel Lunin, a high-ranking official in Ossoaviakhim, the Society for Assistance to Defense and to Aviation Chemical Construction of the USSR, recounted in a Butyrki cell how the thieves in a Moscow Black Maria on March the 8th, International Women's Day, during their transit from the city court to Taganka prison, gang-raped a young bride in his presence, and amid the silent passivity of everyone else in the van. That very morning the girl had come to her trial a free person, as attractively dressed as she could manage. She was on trial for leaving her work without official permission, which in itself was a repulsive fabrication worked up by her chief in revenge for her refusal to live with him. A half hour before the Black Maria, the girl had been sentenced to 5 years under the decree, and had then been shoved into this Black Maria, and right there in broad daylight, somewhere on the park ring, drink Soviet champagne, had been turned into a camp prostitute. And are we really to say that it was the thieves who did this to her, and not the jailers, and not her chief? And thief tenderness, too. Having raped her, they robbed her. They took the fashionable shoes with which she had hoped to charm the judges, and her blouse, which they shoved through to the convoy guards, who stopped the van and went off to get some vodka and handed it in so the thieves could drink at her expense, too. And when they got to the Taganka prison, the girl sobbed out her complaint, and the officer listened to her, yawned, and said, "The government can't provide each of you with individual transportation. We don't have such facilities." Yes, the Black Marias are a bottleneck of the archipelago. If there is no possibility of separating the politicals from the criminals in the Stolypins, then it isn't possible to keep women separate from men in the Black Marias. And just how could one expect the thieves not to live it up en route from one jail to another? Well, and if it weren't for the thieves, we would have to be grateful to the Black Mariahs for our brief encounters with women. Where, if not here, is one to see them, hear them, and touch them in a prison existence? Once, in 1950, they were transporting us from the Butyrki to the station in a not at all crowded van, 14 people in a Black Mariah with benches. Everyone sat down, and suddenly they pushed in one more, a woman, alone. She sat down beside the rear door, fearfully at first. After all, she was totally defenseless against 14 men in a dark cell. But it became clear, after a few words, that all those present were comrades, 58. She gave us her name, Repina, a colonel's wife, and she had been arrested right after he had. And suddenly a silent military man, so young and thin that it seemed he had to be a lieutenant, said to her, "Tell me, weren't you arrested with Antonina I? What, are you her husband?" "Oleg?" "Yes, Lieutenant Colonel. I, from the Funza Academy?" "Yes." What a yes that was. It emerged from a trembling throat, and in it there was more fear of finding out something bad than there was happiness. He sat down next to her. Twilight shafts of summer daylight, diffused through 2 microscopic gratings in the 2 rear doors, flickered around the interior as the van moved along and across the faces of the woman and the lieutenant colonel. She and I were imprisoned in the same cell for 4 months while she was undergoing interrogation. Where is she now? All that time she lived only for you. Her fears weren't for herself, but were all for you. First that they shouldn't arrest you, and then later that you should get a lighter sentence. But what has happened to her now? She blamed herself for your arrest. Things were so hard for her. Where is she now? Just don't be frightened." And Repina put her hands on his chest as if he were her own skin. "She simply couldn't endure the strain. They took her away from us. She, became, well, a little confused. You understand?" And that tiny storm, boxed in sheets of steel, rolled along so peacefully in the 6-lane automobile traffic, stopped at traffic lights, and signaled for a turn. I had met Oleg I in the Butyrki just a few moments before, and here is how it happened. They had herded us into the station box and had brought us our things from the storage room. They called him and me to the door at the same moment. Through the opened door into the corridor, we could see a woman jailer rifling the contents of his suitcase, and she flung out of it and onto the floor a golden shoulder board with the stars of a lieutenant colonel that had survived until then all by itself. Heaven only knows how. She herself hadn't noticed it, and she had accidentally stepped on its big stars with her foot. She had trampled it with her shoe, exactly as in a film shot. I said to him, "Direct your attention to that, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel." And he glowered. After all, he still had his ideas about the spotlessness of the service. And now, here was the next thing, about his wife. And he had had only 1 hour to fit all this in. Chapter 2. The Ports of the Archipelago. Spread out on a large table, the enormous map of our motherland indicate with fat black dots all provincial capitals, all railroad junctions, all transfer points where the railroad line ends in a river route, and where rivers bend and trails begin. What is this? Has the entire map been speckled by infectious flies? What it is, in fact, is precisely the majestic map of the ports of the archipelago. These are not, to be sure, the enchanted ports to which Alexander Grin enticed us, where rum is drunk in taverns and men pay court to beautiful women. It is a rare Zek who was not known from 3 to 5 transit prisons and camps. Many remember a dozen or so, and the sons of Gulag can count up to 50 of them without the slightest difficulty. However, in memory they get all mixed up together because they are so similar in the illiteracy of their convoys, in their inept roll calls based on case files, the long waiting under the beating sun or autumn drizzle, the still longer body searches that involve undressing completely, their haircuts with unsanitary clippers, their cold, slippery baths, Their foul-smelling toilets, their damp and mouldy corridors, their perpetually crowded, nearly always dark, wet cells. The warmth of human flesh flanking you on the floor or on the board bunks, the bumpy ridges of bunk heads knocked together from boards, the wet, almost liquid bread, the gruel cooked from what seemed to be silage. And whoever has a good, sharp memory and can recollect precisely what distinguishes one from another has no need to travel about the country because he knows its geography full well on the basis of transit prisons. Novosibirsk, I know it. I was there. Very strong barracks there made from thick beams. Irkutsk, that was where the windows had been bricked over in several stages. You could see how they had been in Tsarist times, and each course had been laid separately, and only small slits had been left between them. Vologda, yes, an ancient building with towers, the toilets right on top of one another, the wooden partitions rotten, and the ones above leaking down into the ones underneath. Uzman, of course, a lice-ridden, stinking hole of a jail, an ancient vaulted structure, and there they used to pack it so full that whenever they took prisoners out for a transport, you couldn't imagine where they'd put them all, a line strung out halfway through the city. You had better not tell such a connoisseur that you know some city without a transit prison. He will prove to you conclusively that there are no such cities, and he will be right. Salsk. Well, there they keep transit prisoners in the KPZ, cells for preliminary detention, along with prisoners under interrogation. And what do you mean, no transit prison in every district center, too? In Solyetsk? Of course there's one. In Rybinsk? What about prison number 2, a former monastery? It's a quiet one, too, with the empty courtyards paved with old mossy flagstones and clean wooden tubs in the bath. In Chita, prison number 1. In Naushki, not a prison, but a transit camp, which is the same thing. In Torzhok, up the hill, also in a monastery. You must realize, dear sir, that every town has to have its own transit prison. After all, the courts operate everywhere, and how are prisoners to be delivered to camp? By air? Of course, no transit prison is the equal of another, but which is better and which worse is something that can't be settled in an argument. If 3 or 4 Zeks get together, each of them feels bound to praise his own. Let us listen for a while to such a discussion. Well, even if the Ivanovo transit prison isn't one of the more famous, my friends, just ask anybody imprisoned there in the winter of 1937 to 1938. The prison was unheated, and the prisoners not only didn't freeze to death, but on the upper bunks they lay there undressed, and they knocked out all the window panes so as not to suffocate. Instead of the 20 men cell 21 was supposed to contain, there were 323. There was water underneath the bunks, and boards were laid in the water, and people lay on those boards. That was right where the frost poured in from the broken windows. It was like Arctic night down under the bunks. There was no light down there either, because it was cut off by the people lying on the bunks above and standing in the aisle. It was impossible to walk through the aisle to the latrine tank, and people crawled along the edges of the bunks. They didn't distribute rations to individuals, but to units of 10. If one of the 10 died, the others shoved his corpse under the bunks and kept it there until it started to stink. They got the corpse's ration. And all that could have been endured, but the turnkeys seemed to have been oiled with turpentine, and they kept driving the prisoners endlessly from cell to cell, on and on. You just get yourself settled when, come on, get a move on, you're being moved, and you'd have to start in again, trying to find a place. And the reason for such overcrowding was that they hadn't taken anyone to the bath for 3 months. The lice had multiplied, and people had abscesses from the lice on their feet and legs. And typhus, too. And because of the typhus, the prison was quarantined, and no prisoner transports could leave it for 4 months. Well, fellows, the problem there wasn't Ivanovo, but the year. In 1937 to 1938, of course, not just the Zeks, but the very stones of the transit prisons were screaming in agony. Irkutsk was no special transit prison either, but in 1938 the doctors didn't even dare look into the cells, but would walk down the corridor while the turnkey shouted through the door, "Anyone unconscious, come out!" In 1937, fellows, it was that way all across Siberia to the Kolyma, and the big bottleneck was in the Sea of Okhotsk and in Vladivostok. The steamships could transport only 30,000 a month, and they kept driving them on and on from Moscow without taking that into account. Well, and so 100,000 of them piled up. Understand? Who counted them? Whoever was supposed to counted. If you're talking about the Vladivostok transit prison, then in February 1937 there weren't more than 40,000 there. People were stuck there for several months at a time. The bed bugs infested the board bunks like locusts. Half a mug of water a day. There wasn't any more. No one to haul it. There was one whole compound of Koreans, and they all died from dysentery, every last one of them. They took 100 corpses out of our own compound every morning. They were building a morgue, so they hitched the Zeks to the carts and hauled the stone that way. Today you do the hauling, and tomorrow they haul you there yourself. And in autumn the typhus arrived, and we did the same thing. We didn't hand over the corpses till they stank, and took the extra rations. No medication whatever. We crawled to the fence and begged, give us medicine, and the guards fired a volley from the watchtowers. Then they assembled those with typhus in a separate barracks. Some didn't make it there, and only a few came back. The bunks there had 2 stories, and anyone on an upper who was sick and running a fever wasn't able to clamber down to go to the toilet, and so it would all pour down on the people underneath. There were 1,500 sick there, and all the orderlies were thieves. They'd pull out the gold teeth from the corpses, and not only from the corpses. Why do you keep going on and on about 1937? What about 1949 on Veneno Bay in the 5th compound? What about that? There were 35,000, and for several months, too. There was another bottleneck in transport to the Kolyma, and every night, for some reason, they kept driving people from one barracks to another and from one compound to another, just as it was with the fascists. Whistles, screams. Come on out there, without the last one. Without the last one, a menacing command to be understood literally. It meant, I will kill the last man. Literally, or at least warm his hide with a club. And so all piled out so as not to be last. And everyone went on the run, always on the run. They'd drive 100 to get bread, on the run. For gruel, on the run. No bowls to eat from. Take the gruel in whatever you could, the flap of your coat, your hands. They brought water in big tanks, and there was nothing to distribute it in, so they shot it out in sprays, and whoever could get his mouth in front of one got some. Prisoners began to fight in front of the tanks, and the guards fired on them from the towers, exactly like under the fascists. Major General Derevienko, the chief of administration of the Northeast, that is Kolyma, corrective labor camps, came, and while he was there, an Air Force aviator stepped out in front of the crowd and ripped his field shirt down the front. I have 7 battle decorations. Who gave you the right to shoot into the compound? And Derevienko replied, we shot, and we will go on shooting until you learn how to behave. Say there, Bertrand Russell's War Crimes Tribunal, why don't you use this bit of material? Or doesn't it suit you? No, boys, none of those are real transit prisons. Now take Kirov, that was a real one. Let's not take any special year, but say 1947. Even then in Kirov, 2 turnkeys had to work together with their boots to jam people into a cell, that being the only way they could get the door shut. In September, and Kirov, formerly Vyatka, isn't on the Black Sea either, everyone was sitting naked on the 3-story bunks because of the heat. They were sitting because there was no place to lie down. 1 row sat at the heads of the bunks and 1 row at the feet. And 2 rows sat on the floor in the aisle, and others stood between them, and they took turns. They kept their knapsacks in their hands or on their knees because there was nowhere to put them down. Only the thieves were in their lawful places, the 2nd-story bunks next to the windows, and they spread out as they pleased. There were so many bed bugs that they went right on biting in the daytime, and they dive-bombed straight from the ceiling. And people had to suffer through that for a week or even a month. I myself would like to interrupt in order to tell about Krasnaya Presnya in August 1945 in the Victory Summer. But I am shy. This transit prison with its glorious revolutionary name is little known to Muscovites. There are no excursions to it, and how could there be when it is still in operation? But to get a close look at it, you don't have to travel any distance at all. It's a mere stone's throw from the Novokhorovshevo highway on the Circle Line. After all, in Krasnaya Presnya we could somehow stretch out our legs at night, and the bed bugs were moderate, and flies bit us all night long as we lay naked and sweaty under the bright lights. But of course that's nothing at all, and I would be ashamed to boast about it. We streamed with sweat every time we moved, and it simply poured out of us after we ate. There were 100 of us in a cell, a little larger than the average room in an apartment, and we were packed in, and you couldn't find a place on the floor for your feet. And 2 little windows on the south side were blocked with muzzles made of steel sheets. They not only kept the air from circulating, but they got very hot from the sun and radiated heat into the cell. Just as all transit prisons are pointless, talk about transit prisons is pointless, and in all probability this chapter too will turn out to be the same. One doesn't know what to take hold of first, what particular thing to talk about, what to lead off with. And the more people that are crowded into transit prisons, the more pointless it all becomes. It is unbearable for a human being, and it is inexpedient for Gulag, but people sit there month after month. And the transit prison becomes a straight factory. Bread rations are lugged in, stacked up in hand barrows like those in which bricks are hauled, and the steaming gruel is brought in 6-bucket wooden casks that have holes knocked in them with a crowbar. The transit prison at Kotlas was tenser and more above board than many, tenser because it opened the way to the whole northeast of European Russia, and more above board because it was already deep in the archipelago, and there was no need to pretend to anybody. It was simply a piece of land divided into cages by fencing, and the cages were all kept locked. Although it had been thickly settled by peasants when they were exiled in 1930, one must realize that they had no roofs over their heads, but nobody is left to tell about it. Even in 1938, there simply wasn't room for everyone in the frail, 1-story wooden barracks made of discarded end pieces of lumber and covered with tarpaulin. Under the wet autumn snow and in freezing temperatures, people simply lived there on the ground beneath the heavens. True, they weren't allowed to grow numb from inactivity. They were being counted endlessly. They were invigorated by checkups. 20,000 people were there at a time, or by sudden night searches. Later on, tents were pitched in these cages, and log houses 2 stories high were built in some of them. But to reduce the construction costs sensibly, no floor was laid between the stories. 6-story bunks with step ladders were simply built into the sides, up and down which prisoners on their last legs, on the verge of dying, had to clamber like sailors, a structure which would have adorned a ship more appropriately than a port. In the winter of 1944 to 1945, when everyone had a roof over his head, there was room for only 7,500 prisoners, and 50 of them died every day, and the stretchers on which they were carried to the morgue were never idle. People will object that this was quite acceptable, a death rate of less than 1% per day, and that, given that sort of turnover, might manage to last 5 months. Yes, but the main killer was camp labor, and that hadn't even begun yet for transit prisoners. This loss of 2/3 of 1% per day represents sheer shrinkage, and it would be intolerably high even in some vegetable warehouses. The deeper into the archipelago one got, the more obviously did the concrete docks of the archipelago become transformed into wharves made of wooden pilings. In the course of several years, 500,000 people passed through Karabas, the transit camp near Karaganda, whose name became a byword in the language. Yuri Karbe was there in 1942 and was already registered in the 433rd thousand. The transit prison consisted of low, rammed earth barracks with earthen floors. Daily recreation there consisted in driving all the prisoners out with their things and putting artists to work whitewashing the floor and even painting carpets on it. And then in the evenings the zeks would lie down on it, and their bodies would rub out both the whitewash and the carpets. Of all the transit prisons, Karabas was worthiest of becoming a museum, but alas, it no longer exists. In its place there is a factory for reinforced concrete products. The Knayaz Pogost transit point, latitude 63 degrees north, consisted of shacks built on a swamp. Their pole frames were covered with torn tarpaulin tenting that didn't quite reach the ground. The double bunks inside them were also made of poles, from which, incidentally, the branches had been only partially removed, and the aisle was floored with poles also. During the day, the wet mud squelched through the flooring, and at night it froze. In various parts of the area, the walkways were laid on frail and shaky poles, and here and there people whom weakness had made clumsy fell into the water and oozed. In 1938, they fed the prisoners in Knya's Pogost the same thing every day, a mash made of crushed grits and fish bones. This was convenient because there were no bowls, spoons, or forks at the transit prison, and the prisoners had none of their own either. They were herded to the boiler by the dozens, and the mash was ladled into their caps or the flaps of their jackets. And in the transit prison of Vogvozdino, several miles from Ustvim, where 5,000 prisoners were kept at a time. Now, whoever heard of Vogvozdino before this sentence? How many such unknown transit prisons were there, and then multiply that by 5,000? The food was liquid, but they had no bowls either. However, they managed without them. What is there that our Russian ingenuity cannot overcome? By distributing the gruel in wash basins for 10 people at a time, leaving them to race each other, gulping it down. Galina Serebriakova, Boris Dyakov, Allan Semyonov, did you ever gulp from a wash basin 10 at a time? And if you had, you would never, of course, have descended to the animal needs of Ivan Denisovich, would you? And in the midst of the mob scene at the wash basin, you would have continued to think only about your dear party? True, no one was imprisoned in Vogvozdino longer than a year. The kind of prisoner who would have been imprisoned there that long was a prisoner on his last legs whom all the camps had refused to accept. The imagination of writers is poverty-stricken in regard to the native life and customs of the archipelago. When they want to write about the most reprehensible and disgraceful aspect of prison, they always accuse the latrine bucket. In literature, the latrine bucket has become the symbol of prison, a symbol of humiliation, of stink. Oh, how frivolous can you be? Now, was the latrine bucket really an evil for the prisoner? On the contrary, it was the most merciful device of the prison administration. The actual horror began the moment there was no latrine bucket in the cell. In 1937, there were no latrine buckets in certain Siberian prisons, or there weren't enough. Not enough of them had been made ahead of time. Siberian industry hadn't caught up with the full scope of arrests. There were no latrine barrels in the warehouses for the newly created cells. There were old latrine buckets in the cells, but they were antiquated and small, and the only reasonable thing to do at that point was to remove them, since they amounted to nothing at all for the new reinforcements of prisoners. So if, long ago, the Minusинsk prison had been built for 500 people, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin was never inside it. He moved about freely. And there were now 10,000 in it. It meant that each latrine bucket ought to have become 20 times bigger. But it had not. Our Russian pens write only in large letters. We have lived through so very much, and almost none of it has been described and called by its right name. But for Western authors, peering through a microscope at the living cells of everyday life, shaking a test tube in the beam of a strong light, this is, after all, a whole epic, another 10 volumes of remembrance of things past. To describe the perturbation of a human soul placed in a cell filled to 20 times its capacity and with no latrine bucket, where prisoners are taken out to the toilet only once a day. Of course, much of the texture of this life is bound to be quite unknown to Western writers. They wouldn't realize that in this situation one solution was to urinate in your canvas hood, nor would they at all understand one prisoner's advice to another to urinate in his boot. And yet, that advice was the fruit of wisdom derived from vast experience, and it didn't involve spoiling the boot, and it didn't reduce the boot to the status of a pail. It meant that the boot had to be taken off, turned upside down, the boot tops turned inside out and up, and thus a cylindrical vessel was formed that constituted the much-needed container. But at the same time, with what psychological twists and turns Western writers could enrich their literature, without in the least risking any banal repetition of the famous masters, if they only knew about the scheme of things in that same Minusинsk prison. There was only one food bowl for every 4 prisoners, and 1 mug of drinking water per day was issued to each. There were enough mugs to go around. And it could happen that one of the four contrived to use the bowl allotted to him and three others to relieve his internal pressure, and then refused to hand over his daily water ration to wash it out before lunch. What a conflict, what a clash of four personalities, what nuances. And I'm not joking. That is when the rock bottom of a human being is revealed. It is only that Russian pens are too busy to write about it, and Russian eyes don't have time to read about it. I am not joking, because only doctors can tell us how months in such a cell will ruin a human being's health for his entire life, even if he wasn't shot under Yezhov and was rehabilitated under Khrushchev. And just to think that we had dreamed of resting and loosening up a bit in port, after being squashed and doubled up for several days in the Stolypin, how we had dreamed of the transit prison, that we could stretch out a bit there and straighten up, that we would be able to go to the toilet there without hurrying, that we would drink as much water there as we wanted and get as much hot water for tea, that there we wouldn't be forced to ransom our own bread rations from the convoy with our own belongings, that we would be fed hot food there, and that at last we would be taken to the bath, that we could drench ourselves in hot water and stop itching. We had had elbows stuck into our sides and been tossed from side to side in the Black Maria, and they had shouted at us, "Link arms! Take hold of your heels!" But we were in good spirits anyway. It was all right, all right. Soon we would be at the transit prison. And now we were there. And even if some part of our dreams came true in the transit prison, something else would foul it all up anyway. What awaits us in the bath? You can never be sure. They begin suddenly to shave all the women's hair off. In Krasnaya Presnya in November 1950. Or a line of us naked men is clipped by women barbers only. In the Vologda steam room, portly Aunt Motya used to shout, "Stand up, men!" and she'd let the whole line have it from the steam pipe. And the Irkutsk transit prison argued differently. It's more natural for the entire service staff in the bath to be male, and for a man to smear on the medicinal tar ointment between the women's legs. Or during the winter in the cold soaping-up room of the Novosibirsk transit prison, only cold water comes from the faucets. The prisoners make up their minds to ask higher-ups, and a captain comes, puts his own hand unfastidiously under a faucet. "I say, this water is hot. Get it?" I have already wearied of reporting that there are baths which have no water at all, that they scorch clothes in the roaster, that after the bath they compel people to run naked and barefoot through the snow to get their things. The counterintelligence of the Second Byelorussian Front in Brodnica in 1945. From your very first steps in the transit prison, you realize that here you are not in the hands of the jailers or the officers of the prison administration, who at least adhere some of the time to some kind of written law. Here you are in the hands of the trustees, that surly bath attendant who comes to meet your prisoner transport. "Well, go wash, gentlemen fascists." And that work assignment clerk with a plywood writing board who looks over your formation searchingly and hurries you up. And that instructor, clean-shaven except for a prominent forelock, who slaps his leg with that rolled-up newspaper and at the same time gives your bags a once-over. And then other transit prison trustees whom you don't recognize penetrate your suitcases with X-ray eyes. Oh, how alike they all are. And where in your brief prisoner transport journey have you seen them all before? Not so clean-looking, not so well-washed, but the same kind of ugly-mug swine with pitiless, bare-toothed grins. Bah! These are the same Blatnie, the thieves again, those same Urki crooks whom Leonid Utyosov glorifies in his songs. Here again are Zhenka Zhogol, Seryoga Zver, and Dimka Kishkenya, but not behind bars this time. They have been cleaned up, dressed up as representatives of the state. And putting on airs of great importance, they see to it that discipline is observed by us. And if one peers into those snouts, one can even, with imagination, picture that they sprang from the same Russian roots as the rest of us, that once upon a time they were village boys whose fathers bore such names as Klim, Prokhor, Guri, and that their general structure is even similar to our own: 2 nostrils, 2 irises in the eyes, a rosy tongue with which to swallow food and utter certain Russian sounds, which, however, shape totally new words. Every chief of a transit prison has enough presence of mind to realize that he can send his relatives back home the wages for all staff positions, or else he can divvy them up with the other prison officers. And all you have to do is whistle to get as many volunteers as you want from among the socially friendly prison elements to carry out all that work just in return for being allowed to cast anchor at the transit prison and not have to go on to a mine or to the taiga. All these work assignment clerks, office clerks, bookkeepers, instructors, bath attendants, barbers, stockroom clerks, cooks, dishwashers, laundresses, tailors who repair underwear and linens, are permanent transit prison residents. They receive prison rations and are registered in cells, and they swipe the rest of their soup and chow on their own out of the common food pot, or out of the bundles of the transit zecks. All these transit prison trustees regard it as certain that they will never be better off in any camp. We arrive in their hands still not completely plucked, and they bamboozle us to their heart's content. It is they, and not the jailers, who search us and our belongings here, and before the search they suggest we turn in our money for safekeeping. And they seriously write down a list. We never see the list or the money again. We turned in our money. Who to? The officer who has arrived on the scene asks in surprise. Well, it was one of them. Who exactly? The trustees hadn't noticed which one. Why did you turn it over to him? We thought... That's what the turkey thought. Think less and you'll be better off. And that's that. They suggest we leave our things in the vestibule to the bath. No one's going to take them. Who needs them? We leave them, for after all we can't take them into the bath with us anyway. We return, and there are no sweaters left, and no fur-lined mittens. What kind of a sweater was it? Grayish. Well, that means it went to the laundry. They also take things from us honestly, in return for taking a suitcase into the storage room for safekeeping, for putting us in a cell without the thieves, for sending us off on prisoner transports as soon as possible, for not sending us off as long as possible. The only thing they don't do is rob us by main force out in the open. But those aren't thieves, the connoisseurs among us explain. These are the bitches, the ones who work for the prison. They are enemies of the honest thieves, and the honest thieves are the ones imprisoned in cells. But somehow this is hard for our rabbity brains to grasp. Their ways are the same. They have the same kind of tattoos. Maybe they really are enemies of those others, but after all, they are not our friends either. That's how it is. And by this time, they have forced us to sit down in the yard right underneath the cell windows. The windows all have muzzles on them, and you can't look in. But from inside, hoarse, friendly voices advise, "Hey, fellows, you know what they do here? When they search you, they take away everything loose, like tea and tobacco. If you have any, toss it in here, through our window. We'll give it back later." So what do you know? We're suckers and rabbits. Maybe they do take tea and tobacco away. We have read about universal prisoner solidarity in all our great literature, that one prisoner won't deceive another. The way they spoke to us was friendly. "Hey, fellows!" And so we tossed them our tobacco pouches, and the genuine, purebred thieves on the other side catch them and guffaw. "You fascist stoops!" And here are the slogans with which the whole transit prison welcomes us, even though they don't actually hang them on the walls. "Don't look for justice here. You're going to have to hand over everything you've got to us. You'll have to give it all up." This is repeated to you by the jailers, the convoy, and the thieves. You are overwhelmed by your unbearable prison term, and you are trying to figure out how to catch your breath, while everyone around you is figuring out how to plunder you. Everything works out so as to oppress the political prisoner, who is already depressed and abandoned without all that. "You will have to give it all up." The jailer at the gawky transit prison shakes his head hopelessly, and with a sense of relief, Ernst Bernstein gives him his officer's greatcoat. Not free, but in exchange for 2 onions. And why should you complain about the thieves if you see all the jailers at Krasnaya Presnya wearing chrome leather boots they were never issued? They were all lifted by the thieves in the cells and then pushed to the jailers. Why complain about the thieves if the instructor of the cultural and educational department of the camp administration is a Blatnoy, a thief himself, and writes reports on the politicals. The Chem Transit Prison. And how are you ever going to get justice against the thieves in the Rostov Transit Prison when this is their ancient native tribal den? They say that in 1942 at the Gorky Transit Prison, some officer prisoners, including Gavrilov, the military engineer Shechebitin, and others, nonetheless rebelled, beat up the thieves, and forced them to stay in line. But this is always regarded as a legend. Did the thieves capitulate in just one of the cells? For long? And how was it that the Blue Caps allowed the socially hostile elements to beat up the socially friendly ones? And when they say that at the Kotlas Transit Prison in 1940, the thieves started to grab money right out of the hands of the politicals lined up at the commissary, and the politicals began to beat them up so badly that they couldn't be stopped, and the perimeter guards entered the compound with machine guns to defend the thieves? Now there's something that rings true. That's the way it really was. Foolish relatives. They dash about in freedom, borrow money, because they never have that kind of money at home, and send you foodstuffs and things, the widow's last mite, but also a poisoned gift because it transforms you from a free, though hungry person into one who is anxious and cowardly, and it deprives you of that newly dawning enlightenment, that toughening resolve, which are all you need for your descent into the abyss. This book is continued at this point, on the other side of this cassette. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1, Section 2, continued. Cassette 8, Side 2. Foolish relatives. They dash about in freedom, borrow money, because they never have that kind of money at home, and send you foodstuffs and things, the widow's last mite, but also a poisoned gift because it transforms you from a free, though hungry person into one who is anxious and cowardly, and it deprives you of that newly dawning enlightenment, that toughening resolve, which are all you need for your descent into the abyss. O wise gospel saying about the camel and the eye of the needle, these material things will keep you from entering the heavenly kingdom of the liberated spirit. And you see that others in the police van have the same kind of bags as you. Rag-bag bastards, the thieves have already snarled at you in the Black Maria. But there were only 2 of them, and there were 50 of you, and so far they haven't touched you. And now they were holding us for the second day at the Krasnaya Presnya station, with our legs tucked beneath us on the dirty floor, because we were so crowded. However, none of us was observing the life going on around us, because we were all too concerned with how to turn in our suitcases for safekeeping. Even though we were supposed to have the right to turn in our things for safekeeping, nonetheless the only reason the work assignment clerks permitted us to do it was because the prison was a Moscow prison, and we ourselves hadn't yet lost our Moscow look. What a relief. Our things had been checked, and that meant we would have to give them up, not at this transit prison, but later on. The only things left dangling from our hands were our bundles with our ill-fated foodstuffs. Too many of us beavers had been assembled in one place. They began to distribute us among different cells. I was shoved into a cell with that same Valentine whom I had been with the day I signed for my OSO sentence, and who had proposed with touching sentiment that we begin a new life in camp. It was not yet packed full. The aisle was free. There was plenty of space under the bunks. According to the traditional arrangement, the thieves occupied the second tier of bunks. Their senior members were beside the windows, their juniors farther back. A neutral grey mass was on the lower bunks. No one attacked us. Without looking around and without thinking ahead, inexperienced as we were, we sat down on the asphalt floor and crawled under the bunks. We would even be cozy there. The bunks were low for big men to get under, and we had to slide in on our bellies, inching along the asphalt floor. We did, and we were going to lie there quietly and talk quietly. Not a chance. In the semi-darkness, with a wordless rustling, from all sides, juveniles crept up on us on all fours like big rats. They were still boys, some 12-year-olds even, but the criminal code accepted them, too. They had already been processed through a thieves' trial, and they were continuing their apprenticeship with the thieves here. They had been unleashed on us. They jumped us from all sides, and 6 pairs of hands stripped from us and wrenched from under us all our wealth. And all this took place in total silence, with only the sound of sinister sniffing. And we were trapped. We couldn't get up. We couldn't move. It took no more than a minute for them to seize the bundles with the fat, bacon, sugar, and bread. They were gone. We lay there feeling stupid. We had given up our food without a fight, and we could go on lying there now, but that was utterly impossible. Creeping out awkwardly, rear ends first, we got up from under the bunks. Am I a coward? I had thought I wasn't one. I had pushed my way into the heat of a bombing in the open steppe. I hadn't been afraid to drive over a trail obviously mined with anti-tank mines. I had remained cool-headed when I led my battery out of encirclement and went back in for a damaged command car. Why, then, at that moment, didn't I grab one of those human rats and grate his rosy face on the black asphalt? Was he too small? Well, then, go for their leaders. But no. At the front, we are strengthened by some kind of supplementary awareness, and quite false, too, perhaps. Is it a sense of our military unity, the sense of being in the right place at the right time, of duty? But in this new situation, nothing is clear. There are no rules, and everything has to be learned by feel. Getting to my feet, I turned to their senior, the Pakhan, the ringleader of the thieves. All the stolen victuals were there in front of him beside the window on the second tier of bunks. The juvenile rats hadn't eaten a thing themselves. They were disciplined. Nature had sculpted the front part of the ringleader's head, in bipeds usually called a face, with nausea and hate. Or perhaps it had come to be what it was from living the life of a beast of prey. It sagged crookedly and loosely, with a low forehead, a savage scar, and modern steel crowns on the front teeth. His little eyes were exactly large enough to see all familiar objects, and yet not take delight in the beauties of the world. He looked at me as a boar looks at a deer, knowing he could always knock me off my feet. He was waiting. And what did I do? Leap forward to smash my fist in that ugly mug at least once and then go down in the aisle? Alas, I did not. Am I a scoundrel? Until that moment I had always thought that I wasn't, but now, plundered and humiliated, I found it offensive to get down flat on my stomach again and crawl back beneath the bunks. And so I addressed the ringleader of the thieves indignantly and told him that since he had taken our food away from us, he might at least give us a place on the bunks. Now just tell me, wasn't that a natural complaint for a city dweller and an officer? And what happened then? The ringleader of the thieves agreed. After all, I was thereby surrendering any claim to the fat bacon, and I was thereby recognizing his superior authority, and I was revealing a point of view in common with his. He, too, would have driven off the weakest. And he gave orders for 2 of the grey neutrals to get off the lower bunks beside the window and free a space for us. They obeyed submissively, and we lay down in the best places. For a while we still grieved over our loss. The thieves paid no attention to my military breeches. They weren't their kind of uniform. But one of the thieves was already fingering Valentine's woolen trousers. He liked them. And it was only at night that the reproachful whisper of our neighbors reached us. How could we ask the thieves to help us by driving 2 of our own people under the bunks in our place? And only then did awareness of my own meanness prick my conscience and make me blush. And for many years thereafter I blushed every time I remembered it. The grey prisoners on the lower bunks were my own brothers, 58-1B, the POWs. Had I not just a short while ago sworn to assume the burden of their fate? And then I had shunted them off under the bunks. True, they hadn't done anything to defend us against the thieves, but why should they have fought for our fat bacon if we ourselves didn't? They had had enough cruel fights back in POW camps to destroy their faith in decency, but they hadn't done me any harm, and I had them. And thus it is that we have to keep getting banged on flank and snout again and again, so as to become, in time at least, human beings. Yes, human beings. But even for the newcomer whom the transit prison cracks open and shucks, it is very, very necessary. It gives him some gradual preparation for camp life. Such a change, all in one step, would be more than the heart could bear. His consciousness would be unable to orient itself in that murk all at once. It has to happen gradually. Then, too, the transit prison gave the prisoner the semblance of communicating with home. It was there he wrote the first letter he was permitted to, reporting that he hadn't been shot, and sometimes the direction of his prisoner transport. And these were always the first unfamiliar words home of a man who had been ploughed over by interrogation. At home they continued to remember him as he had been, but he would never be that person again. And there could suddenly, like a stroke of lightning, become apparent in one or another clumsily written line. Clumsily written because, even though letters could be sent from transit prisons and there was a mailbox in the yard, it was impossible to get either paper or pencils, or anything to sharpen a pencil with. However, a makorka wrapper, or one from a sugar packet, could turn up and be smoothed out, and someone in the cell would have a pencil. And so lines would be written in an undecipherable scrawl, which would determine the family's future peace or discord. Women, driven out of their minds by receiving such a letter, would sometimes precipitately rush off and try to get to their husbands at the transit prison, even though visits were never allowed, and they would have succeeded only in burdening him with things. One such woman provided, in my opinion, the theme for a monument to all wives, and even indicated the place for it. This was in the Kuibyshev transit prison in 1950. The prison was situated in a low-lying area, from which, however, the Zhiguli gates of the Volga River could be seen. And right above the prison, bordering it on the east, rose a high, long, grassy hill. It was outside the camp compound and above it, and from the inside and down below we couldn't see the approach to it. Very rarely did anyone ever appear up there, although sometimes goats were pastured there or children played. And one cloudy summer day a city woman appeared on its ridge. Shading her eyes with her hand and barely moving, she began to scan our compound from above. At the time, 3 heavily populated cells were taking their outdoor walk in 3 separate exercise yards. And there, in the abyss among those 300 depersonalized ants, she hoped to catch sight of her man. Did she hope that her heart would tell her which one he was? In all probability they had refused to allow her a visit with him, and so she had climbed that hill. Everyone noticed her from the courtyards, and everyone stared at her. Down below in the hollow there was no wind, but it was blowing hard up above. It made her long dress, her jacket, and her long hair stream out and billow, expressing all that love and anxiety which possessed her. I think that a statue of such a woman, right there, on that spot, on the hill overlooking the transit prison, with her face to the Zhiguli gates, just as she actually stood, might explain at least a little something to our grandchildren. After all, some day the hidden and all but lost story of our archipelago will be portrayed in monuments too, and I visualize, for example, one more such project, somewhere on a high point in the Kolyma, a most enormous Stalin, just such a size as he himself dreamed of, with moustaches many feet long, and the bared fangs of a camp commandant, one hand holding the rein, and the other wielding a knout with which to beat his team of hundreds of people harnessed in 5s, and all pulling hard. This would also be a fine sight on the edge of the Chukchi Peninsula, next to the Bering Strait. I had written this before I read The Bas-Relief on the Cliff. And that means there is something to the idea. They say that on Mogutova Hill, at the Zhiguli gates on the Volga, a mile from the camp, there used to be an enormous oil portrait of Stalin, which had been painted on the cliff for the benefit of passing steamers. She was there for a long time, and they didn't drive her off, probably because the guards were too lazy to climb the hill. But finally a soldier climbed up and began to shout and wave his hands at her, and chased her away. The transit prison also gives the prisoner some kind of overall view, some breadth of outlook. As they say, even though there's nothing to eat, still, it's a gay life. In the incessant traffic here, in the comings and goings of dozens and hundreds of people, in the frankness of the stories and conversations. In camp they don't talk so freely because they're always afraid there of stepping into the trap of the oper, the security officer. You are refreshed, you are aired out, you become more lucid, and you begin to understand better what is happening to you, to your people, even to the world. Even one single eccentric who turns up in your cell can tell you things you'll never in your life read about. All of a sudden, they introduce into the cell some kind of miracle. A tall, young military man with a Roman profile, curly and unclipped flaxen locks, in a British uniform, just as if he had come straight from the Normandy landing, an officer of the invading army. He enters as proudly as if he expected everyone to rise to their feet in his presence. And it turns out that he had simply not expected to be among friends at this point. He had already been imprisoned for 2 years, but he had never yet been in a cell, and he had been brought secretly right to the transit prison itself in an individual Stolypin compartment. And then, unexpectedly, either by mistake or else with special intent, he had been admitted to our common stable. He looked around the cell, saw a Wehrmacht officer there in German uniform, and started to argue with him in German. And there they were, arguing heatedly, ready, it seemed, to resort to weapons if they'd had any. 5 years had passed since the war, and it had been drummed into us that in the West the war had been waged only for the sake of appearances, and to us it was strange to observe their mutual outrage. The German had been with us for a long time, and we Russians hadn't argued with him. For the most part, we had laughed with him. No one would have believed the story of Erik Arvid Andersen had it not been for his unshorn locks, a miracle unique in all Gulag, and that foreign bearing of his, and his fluent English, German, and Swedish speech. According to him, he was the son of a rich Swede, not merely a millionaire, but a billionaire. Well, let's assume he embellished a little. On his mother's side, he was a nephew of the British General Robertson, who commanded the British zone in occupied Germany. A Swedish subject, he had served as a volunteer in the British Army, and had actually landed in Normandy, and after the war he had become a Swedish career officer. However, the investigation of social systems remained one of his principal interests. His thirst for socialism was stronger than his attachment to his father's capital. He looked upon Soviet socialism with feelings of profound sympathy, and he had even had the chance to become convinced of its flourishing state with his own eyes when he had come to Moscow as a member of a Swedish military delegation. They had been given banquets and taken to country homes, and there they had encountered no obstacles at all to establishing contact with ordinary Soviet citizens, with pretty actresses who for some reason never had to rush off to work, and who willingly spent time with them, even tete-a-tete. And thus, convinced once and for all of the triumph of our social system, Erik, on his return to the West, wrote articles in the press defending and praising Soviet socialism. And this proved to be his undoing. In those very years, in 1947 and 1948, they were roping in from all sorts of nooks and crannies progressive young Westerners prepared to renounce the West publicly, and it appeared that if they could only have collected another dozen or so, the West would shudder and collapse. Erik's newspaper articles caused him to be regarded as suitable for this category. At the time, he was serving in West Berlin, and he had left his wife in Sweden. And out of pardonable male weakness, he used to visit an unmarried German girl in East Berlin. And it was there that he was bound and gagged one night. And is not this the significance of the proverb which says, "He went to see his cousin, and he ended up in prison"? This had probably been going on for a long time, and he wasn't the first. They took him to Moscow, where Gromyko, who had once dined at his father's home in Stockholm, and who knew the son also, not only returned the hospitality, but proposed to the young man that he renounce publicly both capitalism and his own father. And in return he was promised full and complete capitalist maintenance to the end of his days here in our country. But to Gromyko's surprise, although Erik would not have suffered any material loss, he became indignant and uttered some very insulting words. Since they didn't believe in his strength of mind, they locked him up in a dasha outside Moscow, fed him like a prince in a fairy tale. Sometimes they used awful methods of repression on him. They refused to accept his orders for the following day's menu, and instead of the spring chicken he ordered, they simply brought him a steak, just like that. Surrounded him with the works of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and waited a year for him to be re-educated. To their surprise, it didn't happen. At that point, they quartered with him a former lieutenant general who had already served 2 years in Norilsk. They probably calculated that by relating the horrors of camp, the Lieutenant General would persuade Erik to surrender. But either he carried out that assignment badly, or else he didn't want to carry it out. After 10 months of their being imprisoned together, the only thing he had taught Erik was broken Russian, and he had bolstered Erik's growing repugnance for the Blue Caps. In the summer of 1950, they once more summoned Erik to Vyshinsky, and he once more refused. In so doing, he made existence contingent on consciousness, thereby violating all the Marxist-Leninist rules. And then Abakumov himself read Erik the decree, 20 years in prison. What for? They themselves already regretted having gotten mixed up with this ignoramus, but at the same time they couldn't release him and let him go back to the West, and so they transported him in a separate compartment, and it was there that he had heard the story of the Moscow girl through the partition, and seen through the train window in the dawn light the rotting straw-thatched roofs of the age-old Russia of Ryazan. Those 2 years had very strongly confirmed him in his loyalty to the West. He believed blindly in the West. He did not want to recognize its weaknesses. He considered Western armies unbeatable and Western political leaders faultless. He refused to believe us when we told him that during the period of his imprisonment, Stalin had begun a blockade of Berlin and had gotten away with it perfectly well. Erik's milky neck and creamy cheeks blushed with indignation whenever we ridiculed Churchill and Roosevelt. And he was also certain that the West would not countenance his, Erik's, imprisonment, that on the basis of information from the Kuibyshev transit prison, the Western intelligence services would immediately learn that Erik had not drowned in the Spree River, but had been imprisoned in the Soviet Union, and either he would be ransomed or someone would be exchanged for him. This faith of his in the individual importance of his own fate, among other prisoners' fates, was reminiscent of our own well-intentioned Orthodox Soviet communists. Notwithstanding our heated arguments, he invited my friend and me to Stockholm whenever we could come. "Everyone knows us there," he said with a tired smile. "My father virtually maintains the Swedish king's whole court." For the time being, however, the son of the billionaire had nothing to dry himself with, and I presented him with an extra tattered towel as a gift. And soon they took him away on a prisoner transport. Since that time, I have asked Swedes I have met or travelers going to Sweden how to find his family. Have they heard anything about such a missing person? The only reply I have received is a smile. The name Andersen in Sweden is like Ivanov in Russia, and there is no such billionaire. And it is only now, 22 years later, rereading this book for the last time, that I have suddenly realized, of course, they must have forbidden him to give his real name. He must have been warned by Abakumov, of course, that he would be destroyed if he did. And so he traveled through the transit prisons in the guise of a Swedish Ivanov, and it was only through unforbidden secondary details of his biography that he was able to leave behind in the memories of those he encountered by chance some trace of his ruined life. More likely he still thought it could be saved, which was only human, like millions of other rabbits in this book. He thought he would be imprisoned for a while, and that thereupon the indignant West would free him. He did not understand the strength of the East, and he did not understand that such a witness as himself, who had displayed such firmness of will unheard of in the soft West, could never be released. Yet, perhaps he is still alive, even today. Author's Note, 1972. And the movement of people was endless. Prisoners were brought in and taken away, singly and in groups, and driven off in prisoner transports. Appearing so businesslike on the surface, so planned, this movement was marked by such stupidity that one can hardly believe it. In 1949, the special camps were created. And then and there, on the basis of some summit decision, masses of women were driven from camps in the European north and the Trans-Volga area, through the Sverdlovsk transit prison, to Siberia, to Taishet, to Odzerlag. But in 1950, someone found it convenient to assemble all the women, not in Odzerlag, but in Dubrovlag, in Temnikov, in Mordvinia. And so all those same women, enjoying all the conveniences of Gulag travel, were dragged through this same Sverdlovsk transit prison to the west. In 1951, new special camps were set up in Kemerovo province, Kamishlag, and that turned out to be where the women's labor was required. and those ill-fated women were again put to the torment of being sent to the Kemerovo camps through that same accursed Sverdlovsk transit prison. The time came for liberation, but not for all of them. All those women who were left to drag out their terms in the midst of the general Khrushchev relaxation were once again swung out of Siberia through the Sverdlovsk transit prison into Mordvinia. It was thought better to have them all together. Well, after all, we have our own self-contained economy. The isles are all our own, and the distances aren't so very great for a Russian. And the same sort of thing happened to individual Zeks, the more unfortunate ones. Shendrik was a big, merry, open-faced fellow, and he labored honestly, as they say, in one of the Kuibyshev camps, and had no intimation of the evil fate overtaking him. But this evil fate struck nonetheless. An urgent order arrived at the camp, not just from anybody, but from the Minister of Internal Affairs himself. And how could the minister know of Shendrik's existence? The order was to deliver this Shendrik to prison number 18 in Moscow immediately. They grabbed him, dragged him off to the Kuibyshev transit prison, and from there to Moscow with no delay. But not to some prison number 18. Instead, with all the rest, he went to the widely known Krasnaya Presnya prison. Shendrik didn't know about any prison number 18. No one had told him. But his misfortune did not drowse. No more than 2 days had passed before they jerked him onto a prisoner transport again, and this time took him all the way to Pechora. The landscape outside the train window grew even sparser and grimmer. Shendrik was alarmed. He knew there was an order from the minister, and here they were rapidly hauling him off to the north, and that meant that the minister had some awful evidence against him. In addition to all the other torments of the trip, they stole 3 days of bread rations from him while he was en route. And by the time he got to Pechora, he was staggering. Pechora greeted him inhospitably. They drove him out to work in the wet snow, hungry and unsettled. In 2 days, he never had a chance to dry out his shirts, nor even a chance to stuff his mattress with pine needles. And right then they ordered him to turn in everything he had that was government issue, and once again they scooped him up and whisked him still farther, to Vorkuta. It seemed quite evident from everything that had happened that the minister was determined to destroy Shendrik, and not him alone, but the entire group in his prisoner transport. At Vorkuta they didn't touch Shendrik for a whole month. He went out to general assignment work, even though he had not yet recovered from his travels, but he had begun to reconcile himself to his Arctic fate. And then, suddenly, one day, they called him out of the mine and chased him off breathless to the camp to turn in everything he had that was government issue, and in 1 hour's time he was being carried off to the south. Now, by this time, it had already begun to smell of personal vengeance. They took him to Moscow prison number 18. They held him in the cell there for 1 month. And then he was summoned to some lieutenant colonel who asked him, "Where the hell have you been? Are you really a mechanical engineer?" And Shendrik confessed that he was. And then they took him off to none other than, yes, the Paradise Islands. Yes, there are such islands in the archipelago. This coming and going of people, these destinies and these stories, greatly enliven the transit prisons, and the old camp veterans advise newcomers, "Lie down and take it easy. They feed you the guaranteed minimum here, and you don't have to tire your back." The rations guaranteed by Gulag when no work is being done. And when it's not crowded, you can sleep as much as you want to. So just stretch out and lie there from one handout of gruel to the next. The food is sparse, but the sleeping is good. Only those who know what general assignment work is in the camps will understand that a transit prison is a rest home, a happiness on our path. And one more advantage, too. When you sleep in the daytime, the hours pass more quickly. If you can just kill off the day, the night will go away on its own. True, recalling that labor created the human being and that only labor can reform the criminal, and sometimes having auxiliary projects, and sometimes acting as subcontractors in order to keep up their financial end, the bosses of transit prisons might sometimes even drive their loafing transit manpower out to labor. The work at that same Kotlas transit prison before the war was not the least bit easier than in a regular camp. In the course of a winter day, 6 or 7 weakened prisoners were harnessed to a tractor, sledge, and had to drag it 7 miles along the Dvina River to the mouth of the Vychegda. They got stuck in snow and fell down, and the sledges got stuck, and it would seem that any work more wearing and debilitating could hardly have been thought up. But it turned out that this wasn't the actual work, but merely the warm-up. There at the mouth of the Vychegda, they had to load 13 cubic yards of firewood on the sledges, and the same people harnessed in the same way. Repin is no longer with us, and this is no subject for our new artists. It is merely a crude reproduction from nature. Had to haul the sledges back to their transit prison home. Now, what does a camp have to offer after that? You wouldn't even survive to get there. The work brigade leader for that task was Kolupayev, and the work horses were electrical engineer Dmitriev, quartermaster corps Lieutenant Colonel Belyayev, and Vasily Vlasov, who is already familiar to us. But not all the other names can be collected at this date. During the war, the Arzamas transit prison fed its prisoners beet tops, and at the same time put them to work on a permanent basis. There were garment shops, a footgear felting shop, where woolen fibers were fulled in hot water and acids. In the summer of 1945, we went out of the stiflingly stagnant cells of Krasnaya Presnya to work as volunteers, for the right to breathe air the whole day long, for the right to sit unhurried and unhindered in a quiet plank latrine, an incentive that is often overlooked, heated by the August sun. And these were the days of Potsdam and Hiroshima. Listening to the peaceful buzzing of a lonely bee, and last for the right to get an extra quarter-pound of bread at night. They took us to the wharves of the Moscow River, where timber was being unloaded. It was our job to roll the logs off some of the piles, carry them over and stack them in other piles. We spent a good deal more strength than we received extra food in compensation. Nonetheless, we enjoyed going out to work there. I often have to blush at my recollections of my younger years, and that's where my younger years were spent. But whatever casts you down also teaches you a lot, and it turned out that as a residue of the officers' shoulder boards, which had trembled and fluttered on my shoulders for 2 years in all, some kind of poisonous golden dust had settled in the empty space between my ribs. On that river wharf, which was a camplet, too, there was also a compound with watchtowers surrounding it. We were merely transient, temporary work sloggers, and there had been no talk at all, no rumor that we might be allowed to stay and serve out our terms there. But when they formed us up for the first time, and the work assignment foreman looked down the line to pick out temporary work brigade leaders, my worthless heart was bursting under my woolen field shirt. Me, pick me! I was not chosen. But why did I want it? I would only have made further shameful mistakes. Oh, how hard it is to part with power. This one has to understand. There was a time when Krasnaya Presnya became the virtual capital of Gulag, in the sense that no matter where you went, you couldn't bypass it, just like Moscow. Just as, when one travels in the Soviet Union, it is more convenient to proceed from Tashkent to Sochi and from Chernigov to Minsk via Moscow, they dragged the prisoners there from all over and sent them off all over via Presnya. And that was the way it was when I was there. Presnya was at the point of breakdown from overcrowding. They built a supplementary building. Only the through trains of cattle cars carrying those who had been sentenced right at counterintelligence bypassed Moscow on the circle line around it, which, as it happened, went right past Presnya, perhaps even saluting it with a whistle on the way. But we do have a ticket when we come to Moscow as free passengers in transit, and we hope sooner or later to proceed in the desired direction. At Presnya, at the end of the war and just after, not only the prisoners who arrived there, but even the very highest-ranking officials, and even the heads of Gulag itself, were unable to predict who would proceed where. At that time, the prison system had not yet crystallized as it had by the 50s, and there were no routes and no destinations were indicated for anybody, except perhaps for service instructions. Keep under strict guard. To be employed only on general assignment work. The convoy sergeants carried the bundles of prison cases, torn folders tied somehow with twine or ersatz cotton string made of paper, into a separate wooden building that housed the prison offices, and tossed them onto shelves, on tables, under chairs, and simply on the floor in the aisle, just as their subject prisoners lay in the cells. They became untied and got scattered and mixed up. One room, a second, and a third got filled with those mixed-up cases. Secretaries from the prison office, well-fed, lazy, free women in bright-colored dresses, sweated in the heat, fanned themselves and flirted with prison and convoy officers. None of them wanted to or had the strength to pick a way through that chaos, and yet the trainloads had to be dispatched in the red trains several times a week, and every day 100 people had to be sent out on trucks to nearby camps. The case of every Zek had to be sent with him. So just who was going to work on all that long, drawn-out mess? Who was there to sort out the cases and select the prisoners for the transports? It was entrusted to several work assignment supervisors from among the transit prison trustees, who were either bitches or half-breeds. Half-breeds, or mulattoes, politsvetnia in Russian, were prisoners who had grown spiritually close to the thieves and tried to imitate them, but who had nonetheless not been accepted by the thieves' law. They moved freely through the prison corridors, entered the prison office, and were the ones who decided whether your case would be put in a bad prisoner transport, or whether they would really exert themselves, search long and hard, and put it in a good one. The newcomers were not mistaken in thinking that there were whole camps which were death camps, and they were right about that, but their idea that there were some that were good was simply a delusion. There were no good camps, but only certain easier duties within them, and they could only be sorted out on the spot. The fact that the prisoner's whole future depended on such another prisoner with whom one ought perhaps to find the chance to talk, even if via the bath attendant, and whose hand one ought perhaps to grease, even if via the storage room keeper, was worse than if his fortunes had simply been determined blindly by a roll of the dice. This invisible and unrealized opportunity to go south to Nalchik instead of north to Norilsk, in return for a leather jacket, to go to Serebryanny, Bor, outside Moscow, instead of Taishet in Siberia, for a couple of pounds of fat bacon, and perhaps to lose both the leather jacket and the fat bacon for nothing at all, only aggravated and fatigued, tired souls. Maybe someone did manage to arrange it, maybe someone got himself fixed up that way, but most blessed of all were those who had nothing to give or who spared themselves all that anxiety. Submissiveness to fate, the total abdication of your own will in the shaping of your life, the recognition that it was impossible to guess the best and the worst ahead of time, but that it was easy to take a step you would reproach yourself for, all this freed the prisoner from any bondage, made him calmer, and even ennobled him. And thus it was that the prisoners lay in rows in the cells, and their fates lay in undisturbed piles in the rooms of the prison office. And the assignment supervisors took the files from the particular corner where it was easiest to get at them. And some Zeks had to spend 2 or 3 months gasping in this accursed Presnia, while others would whiz through it with the speed of a shooting star. As a result of all that congestion, haste, and disorder with the cases, sometimes sentences got switched at Presnia, and at other transit prisons as well. This didn't affect the 58s, because their prison terms, in Maxim Gorky's phrase, were terms with a capital letter, were intended to be long, and even when they seemed to be nearing their end, they just never got there anyway. But it made sense for big thieves and murderers to switch with some stupid non-political offender, and so they or their accomplices would inch up to such an individual and question him with interest and concern. And he, not knowing that a short-termer at a transit prison isn't supposed to disclose anything about himself, would innocently tell them that his name was, for example, Vasily Parvenich Yefrashkin, that he was born in 1913, that he lived in Semidubye, and had been born there, and his term was 1 year. Article 109, negligence. And then Yevrashkin was asleep, or maybe not even asleep, but there was such a racket in the cell, and there was such a crowd at the swill trough in the door, that he couldn't make his way there and listen, while on the other side of it in the corridor they were rapidly muttering a list of names for a prisoner transport. Some of the names were shouted from the door into the cell, but not Yevrashkin's, because hardly had the name been read out in the corridor than an urka, a thief, had obsequiously, and they can be obsequious when it's necessary, shoved up his snout and answered quickly and quietly, "Vasily Parvenyich, born 1913, village of Semidubye, 109, 1 year," and ran off to get his things. The real Yevrashkin yawned, lay back on his bunk, and patiently waited to be called the next day, and the next week, and the next month, and then he made so bold as to bother the prison superintendent why hadn't he been taken in a prisoner transport. And every day in all the cells they kept calling out the name of some Zviaga. And when a month later, or a half-year later, they got around to combing through all the cases by calling the roll, what they had left was just one file, belonging to Zviaga, a multiple offender sentenced for a double murder and robbing a store, 10 years, and one shy prisoner who was trying to tell everybody that he was Yevrashkin, although you couldn't make anything out from the photo, and so he damn well was Zviaga, and he had to be tucked away in a penalty camp, Ivdelag, because otherwise it would have been necessary to confess that the transit prison had made a mistake. And as for that other Yevrashkin who had been sent off on a prisoner transport, you wouldn't even be able to find where he had gone, because none of the lists were left. And anyway, he had only had a 1-year term and had been sent to do farm work without being under guard, and got 3 days off his sentence for every day he worked, or else he had simply run away and was long since home, or, more likely, was already imprisoned again on a new sentence. There were also eccentrics who sold their short terms for a kilo or 2 of fat bacon. They figured that in any case the authorities would check up and establish their correct identities, and sometimes they did. And, as P. Yakubovich writes in reference to the so-called cadgers, the sale of prison terms took place in the last century too. It is an ancient prison trick. During the years when the prisoners' cases didn't carry any indication of their final destination, the transit prisons turned into slave markets. The most desired guests at the transit prisons were the buyers. This word was heard more and more often in the corridors and cells, and was used without any shadow of irony, just as it became intolerable everywhere in industry simply to sit and wait until things were sent from the center on the basis of allocations, and it was more satisfactory to send one's own pushers and pullers to get things done. The same thing happened in Gulag. The natives on the islands kept dying off, and even though they cost not 1 ruble, account was kept of them, and one had to worry about getting more of them for oneself so there wouldn't be any failure in fulfilling the plan. The buyers had to be sharp, have good eyes, and look carefully to see what they were taking so that last-leggers and invalids didn't get shoved off on them. The buyers who picked a transport on the basis of case files were poor buyers. The conscientious merchants demanded that the merchandise be displayed alive and bare-skinned for them to inspect. And that was just what they used to say, without smiling, merchandise. "Well, what merchandise have you brought?" asked a buyer at the Butirki station, observing and inspecting the female attributes of 17-year-old Ira Kalina. Human nature, if it changes at all, changes not much faster than the geological face of the earth, and the very same sensations of curiosity, relish, and sizing up which slave traders felt at the slave girl markets 25 centuries ago, of course possessed the Gulag bigwigs in the Uzman prison in 1947, when they, a couple of dozen men in MVD uniform, sat at several desks covered with sheets. This was for their self-importance, since it would have seemed awkward otherwise. And all the women prisoners were made to undress in the box next door, and to walk in front of them barefooted and bare-skinned, turn around, stop, and answer questions. "Drop your hands," they ordered those who had adopted the defensive pose of classic sculpture. After all, these officers were very seriously selecting bedmates for themselves and their colleagues. And so it was that for the new prisoner various manifestations foreshadowed the camp battle of the morrow, and cast their pall over the innocent spiritual joys of the transit prison. For just 2 nights they put a special assignment prisoner in our cell in Krasnaya Presnya, and he was next to me in the bunk. He travelled about with special assignment orders, which meant that an invoice had been filled out in central administration indicating that he was a construction technician and could be used only in that capacity in his new location, and this went with him from camp to camp. The special assignment prisoner was travelling in the common Stolypin cars and was kept in the common cells of the transit prisons, but he wasn't nervous. He was protected by his personal document, and he wouldn't be driven out to fell timber. A cruel and determined expression was the principal trait of this camp veteran's face. He had already served out the greater part of his term, and I did not yet realize that this exact expression would in time etch itself on all our faces, because a cruel and determined expression is the national hallmark of the Gulag Islanders. People with soft, conciliatory expressions die out quickly on the islands. He observed our naive floundering with an ironic smile, just as people look at 2-week-old puppies. What should we expect in camp? Taking pity on us, he taught us. From your very first step in camp, everyone will try to deceive and plunder you. Trust no one but yourself. Look around quickly. Someone may be sneaking up on you to bite you. 8 years ago, I arrived at Kargopolag just as innocent and just as naive as you are now. They unloaded us from 2 trains, and the convoy prepared to lead us the 6 miles to the camp through the deep, crumbly snow. This book is continued on Cassette 9, Side 1. Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1, Section 2, continued. Cassette 9, Side 1. They unloaded us from 2 trains, and the convoy prepared to lead us the 6 miles to the camp through the deep, crumbly snow. 3 sleds came up beside us. Some hefty chap whom the convoy didn't interfere with came over to us and said, "Brothers, put your things on the sleds, and we will carry them there for you." We remembered reading in books that prisoners' belongings were carried on carts, and we thought, it isn't going to be all that inhuman in camp. They're concerned about us. And we loaded our things on the sleds. They left, and we never saw them again, not even an empty wrapper. But how can that happen? Isn't there any law there? Don't ask idiotic questions. There is a law there, the law of the taiga, of the jungle. But as for justice, there never has been any in Gulag, and there never will be. That cargo pole incident was simply a symbol of Gulag, and you have to get used to something else, too. In camp, no one ever does anything for nothing. No one ever does anything out of the generosity of his heart. You have to pay for everything. If someone proposes something to you that is unselfish, disinterested, you can be sure it's a dirty trick, a provocation. The main thing is, avoid general assignment work. Avoid it from the day you arrive. If you land in general assignment work that first day, then you are lost, and this time for keeps. General assignment work? General assignment work, that is the main and basic work performed in any given camp. 80% of the prisoners work at it, and they all die off. All. And then they bring new ones in to take their places, and they again are sent to general assignment work. Doing this work, you expend the last of your strength, and you are always hungry, and always wet, and shoeless, and you are given short rations and short everything else, and put in the worst barracks, and they won't give you any treatment when you're ill. The only ones who survive in camps are those who try at any price not to be put on general assignment work, from the first day. At any price? At any price. At Krasnaya Presnya, I assimilated and accepted this altogether unexaggerated advice of the cruel special assignment prisoner, forgetting only to ask him one thing. How do you measure that price? How high do you go? Chapter 3. The Slave Caravans. It was painful to travel in a Stolypin, unbearable in a Black Maria, and the transit prison would soon wear you down, and it might just be better to skip the whole lot and go straight to camp in the red cattle cars. As always, the interests of the state and the interests of the individual coincided here. It was also to the state's advantage to dispatch sentenced prisoners straight to the camps by direct routing and thus avoid overloading the city trunk line railroads, automotive transport, and transit camp personnel. They had long since grasped this fact in Gulag, and it had been taken to heart. Witness the caravans of red cows, red cattle cars, the caravans of barges, and where there were no rails and no water, the caravans on foot. After all, prisoners could not be allowed to exploit the labor of horses and camels. The red trains were always a help when the courts in some particular place were working swiftly or the transit facilities were overcrowded. It was possible in this way to dispatch a large number of prisoners in one batch. That is how the millions of peasants were transported in 1929 to 1931. That is how they exiled Leningrad from Leningrad. That is how they populated the Kolyma in the 30s. Every day, Moscow, the capital of our country, belched out one such train to Sovetskaya Gavan, to Vanino Port. And each provincial capital also sent off red trainloads, but not on a daily schedule. That is how they removed the Volga German Republic to Kazakhstan in 1941. And later, all the rest of the exiled nations were sent off in the same way. In 1945, Russia's prodigal sons and daughters were sent from Germany, from Czechoslovakia, from Austria, and simply from western border areas, whoever had gotten there on his own, in such trains as these. In 1949, that is how they collected the 58s in special camps. The Stolypins follow routine railroad schedules, and the red trains travel on imposing waybills signed by important Gulag generals. The Stolypins cannot go to an empty site, to nowhere. Their destination must always be a station, even if it's in some nasty little two-bit town with some preliminary detention cells in an attic. But the red trains can go into emptiness, and wherever one does go, there immediately rises right next to it, out of the sea of the steppe or the sea of the taiga, a new island of the archipelago. Not every red cattle car is ready as is to transport prisoners. First it has to be prepared, but not in the sense some of our readers might expect, that the coal or lime it carried before it was assigned to carry people has to be swept out and the car cleaned. That isn't always done. Nor in the sense that it needs to be caulked and have a stove installed if it is winter. When the section of the railroad from Knyazh Pogost to Ropcha was being built, and wasn't yet part of the general railroad network, they immediately began to transport prisoners on it, in freight cars without either stoves or bunks. In winter, the Zeks lay on the icy, snowy floor, and weren't even given any hot food, because the train could make it all the way through this section in less than a day. Whoever can, in imagination, lie there like them and survive those 18 to 20 hours, shall indeed survive. Here is what was involved in preparing a red cattle car for prisoners. The floors, walls, and ceilings had to be tested for strength and checked for holes or faults. Their small windows had to be barred. A hole had to be cut in the floor to serve as a drain, and specially protected by sheet iron firmly nailed down all around it. The necessary number of platforms on which convoy guards would stand with machine guns had to be evenly distributed throughout the train, and if there were too few, more had to be built. Access to the roofs of the cars had to be provided. Sites for searchlights had to be selected and supplied with uninterrupted electric power. Long-handled wooden mallets had to be procured. A passenger car had to be hooked on for the staff, and if there wasn't one, then instead heated freight cars had to be prepared for the chief of convoy, the security officer, and the convoy. Kitchens had to be built for the convoy and for the prisoners. And only after all this had been done was it all right to walk along the cattle cars and chalk on the sides special equipment or perishable goods. In her chapter, The Seventh Car, Yevgenia Ginsburg described the transport of red cars very vividly, and her description largely obviates the necessity of presenting details here. The preparation of the train has been completed, and ahead lies the complicated combat operation of loading the prisoners into the cars. At this point, there are two important and obligatory objectives: to conceal the loading from ordinary citizens, to terrorize the prisoners. To conceal the loading from the local population was necessary because approximately 1,000 people were being loaded on the train simultaneously, at least 25 cars, and this wasn't your little group from a Stolypin that could be led right past the townspeople. Everyone knew, of course, that arrests were being made every day and every hour, but no one was to be horrified by the sight of large numbers of them together. In Orel in 1938, you could hardly hide the fact that there was no home in the city where there hadn't been arrests, and weeping women in their peasant carts blocked the square in front of the Orel prison, just as in Surikov's painting, The Execution of the Streltsy. Oh, who one day will paint this latter-day tragedy for us? But no one will. It's not fashionable. Not fashionable. But you don't need to show our Soviet people an entire trainload of them collected in one day. And in Orel that year there were. And young people mustn't see it either, for young people are our future. Therefore it was done only at night, and every night, too, each and every night, and that was the way it went for several months. The black line of prisoners to be transported was driven from the prison to the station on foot. Meanwhile, the Black Mariahs were busy making new arrests. True, the women realized, the women somehow found out, and at night they came to the station from all over the city and kept watch over the trains on the siding. They ran along the cars, tripping over the ties and rails, and shouting
This is a really
at every
hard
car,
boss fight.
"It's so-and-so in there! It's so-and-so in there!" And they ran on to the next one, and others ran up to this one. "Is so-and-so in there?" And suddenly an answer would come from the sealed car, "I'm in here, I'm here." Or else, "Keep looking for him, he's in another car." Or else, "Women, listen, my wife is somewhere out there near the station, run and tell her." These scenes, unworthy of our contemporary world, testify only to the then inept organization of train embarkations. The mistakes were noted, and after a certain night the trains were surrounded in depth by cordons of snarling and barking police dogs. And in Moscow, the loading into red cattle cars from the old Sretenka transit prison, which prisoners no longer remember, or from Krasnaya Presnya, took place only at night. That was the rule. However, although the convoy had no use for the superfluous light of the sun by day, on the other hand, they made use of suns by night, the searchlights.
This part's
They were
really
more
hard.
efficient, since they could be concentrated on the necessary area, where the prisoners were seated on the earth in a frightened pack awaiting the command, "Next unit of 5, stand up, to the car, on the run." Only on the run, so as not to have time to look around, to think things over, to run as though chased by the dogs, afraid of nothing so much as falling down. On that uneven path, up the loading ramp, scrambling. And clear, hostile searchlight beams not only provided light, but were an important theatrical element in terrorizing the prisoners, along with yells, threats, gun-stock blows on those who fell behind, and the order, "Sit down." And sometimes, as in the station square of that same Orel, "Down on your knees." And like some new breed of believers at prayer, the whole 1,000 would get down on their knees. Along with that running to the car, quite unnecessary except for intimidation, for which it was very important. Along with the enraged barking of the dogs. Along with the leveled gun barrels, rifles or automatic pistols, depending on the decade. And the main thing was to undermine, to crush the prisoner's willpower so he wouldn't think of trying to escape, so that for a long time he wouldn't notice his new advantage, the fact that he had exchanged a stone-walled prison for a railroad car with thin plank walls. But in order to load 1,000 prisoners into railroad cars at night so precisely, the prison had to start jerking them out of their cells and processing them for transport the morning before, and the convoy had to spend the entire day on a long, drawn-out and strict procedure of checking them in while still in prison, and then holding those who'd been checked in for long hours, not, of course, in the cells by now, but in the courtyard, on the ground, so as not to mix them up with the prisoners still belonging in the prison. Thus, For the prisoner, the loading at night was only a relief after a whole day of torment. Besides the ordinary counts, verifications, hair clipping, clothing roasting, and baths, the core of the preparation for the prisoner transport was general frisking. This search was carried out not by the prison, but by the convoy receiving the prisoners.
Where the heck is he?
Convoy was expected
My God, I'm gonna
in accordance
die
with
here.
the directives regarding the red transports, and in accordance with their own operational requirements, to carry out this search so that the prisoners would not be left in possession of anything that might help them to escape, to take away everything that could saw or cut, all powders, tooth powder, sugar, salt, tobacco, tea, so that they could not be used to blind the convoy, all string, cord, twine, belts, and straps, because they could all be used in escaping, and that meant all kinds of straps, and so they cut off the straps which held up the artificial limb of a one-legged man, and the cripple had to carry his artificial leg on his shoulder.
Oh my God, I still died.
With the help of those on either side of him. The rest of the things, all valuables and suitcases too, were, according to instructions, supposed to be checked and carried in a special baggage car and returned to their owners at the end of the journey. Yet the power of the Moscow directive was weak, and might be ignored by the Vologda or the Kuibyshev convoy, while the power of the convoy over the prisoners was very corporeal, very real, and this fact was crucial to the third objective of the loading operation. In simple justice, to take all the good things they possess from enemies of the people for the use of its sons. Sit down, on your knees, strip. In these statutory orders of the convoy lay the basic power one could not argue with. After all, a naked person loses his self-assurance. He cannot straighten up proudly and speak as an equal to people who are still clothed. A search begins. Kuibyshev, summer of 1949. Naked prisoners approach, carrying their possessions and the clothes they've taken off. A mass of armed soldiers surrounds them. It doesn't look as though they were going to be led to a prisoner transport, but as though they are going to be shot immediately or put to death in a gas chamber. And in that mood, a human being ceases to concern himself with his possessions. The convoy does everything with intentional brusqueness, rudely, sharply, not speaking one word in an ordinary human voice. After all,
I think that's really lucky.
Disheartened. Suitcases are shaken apart, and things fall all over the floor, and are then stacked up in separate piles. Cigarette cases, billfolds, and other pitiful valuables are all taken away and thrown without any identifying marks into a barrel that is standing nearby. And for some reason, the fact that this particular receptacle isn't a safe or a trunk or a box, but a barrel, particularly depresses the naked prisoners there, and it seems so terribly futile to protest. The naked prisoner has all he can do simply to snatch up his well-searched rags from the floor and knot them together or tie them up in a blanket. Felt boots, you can check them, throw them over there, sign for them on the list. You aren't the one who gets the receipt, but you are the one who signs for having surrendered them, certifying that you threw them onto the pile. And when, at dusk, the last truck leaves the prison yard with the prisoners, they see the convoy guards rushing to grab the best leather suitcases from the pile and select the best cigarette cases from the barrel. And after them, the jailers scurry for their booty too, and last of all, the transit prison trusties. That is what it costs to spend one day to get to the cattle car. And now, the prisoners have clambered with relief up onto the splintered planks of the bunks. But what kind of relief is this? What kind of heated cattle car is this? Once again, they are squeezed in a nutcracker between cold and starvation, between the thieves and the convoy. If there are thieves in a cattle car, and they are, of course, not kept separate in the red trains either, they take the best places, as is traditional, on the upper bunks by the window. That's in summer. So we can guess where their places are in winter, next to the stove, of course, in a tight ring around the stove. As the former thief Minayev recalls, In 1949, during a severe cold wave, they were issued only 3 pails of coal for their car for the entire journey from Voronezh to Kutlas, lasting several days. And in this crisis, the thieves not only occupied the places around the stove, and not only took all the suckers' warm things away from them and put them on, but didn't even hesitate to take their footcloths out of their shoes and wind them around their own feet. You today, me tomorrow. It was somewhat worse with food. The thieves took charge of the whole ration for the car, and then kept the best for themselves, along with whatever else they needed. Loshchilin recalls a 3-day prisoner transport from Moscow to Peterborough in 1937. They didn't cook anything hot on the train for such a short journey, and handed out only dry rations. The thieves took the best for themselves, but gave the others permission to divide up the bread and the herring, and that meant they weren't hungry. When the ration was hot and the thieves were in charge of distributing it, they divided up the gruel among themselves, a 3-week transport from Kishinev to Pechora in 1945. With all this, the thieves didn't scruple to engage also in plain and simple robbery en route. They noticed an Estonian's gold teeth, and they pushed him down and knocked out the teeth with a poker. The Zeks considered the hot food the real advantage of the red trains. At remote stations, again where people couldn't see them, the trains stopped, and gruel and porridge were doled out to the cars. But they even managed to give out the hot food in such a way that things went wrong. They might, as on that same Kishinev train, pour out the gruel in the same pails in which they issued coal, there being nothing to wash them out with. Because drinking water was also rationed on the train and was even in shorter supply than gruel. And so you gulped down the gruel, your teeth gritting on pieces of coal. Or they brought the gruel and the hot cereal to the car and didn't issue enough bowls, 25 instead of 40, and promptly ordered, come on, faster, faster, we have other cars to feed too, not just you." How then could you eat? How could you divide it up? You couldn't dish it out equitably on the basis of bowls, and that meant you had to estimate each portion so as not to give out too much. And those to be served first would shout, stir it, and the last kept silent. There would be more on the bottom. The first were eating, and the last waiting. They would have liked the others to eat faster because they were hungry, and meanwhile the gruel would be getting cold in the barrel, and they were also being hurried from outside. "Well, have you finished? Come on now, get a move on." And then they served the second contingent, not more and not less, and not thicker and not thinner than the first. And then came estimating the leftovers correctly and pouring them out 2 portions to a bowl. And all this time 40 people don't so much eat as watch the sharing out and suffer. They don't heat the car, they don't protect the other prisoners from the thieves, they don't give you enough to drink, and they don't give you enough to eat. But on the other hand, they don't let you sleep either. During the day, the convoy can see the whole train very clearly and the tracks behind them, and can be sure that no one has jumped out the side or slipped down on the rails. But at night, vigilance possesses them. With long-handled wooden mallets, the standard Gulag equipment, they knock resoundingly on every board of the car at every stop. Maybe someone has sawed through it. And at certain stops, the door of the car is thrown open. The light of the lantern or the beam of the searchlight. "Check up!" And this means, get on your feet and be ready to go where they tell you. Everyone run to the left or to the right. The convoy guards jump inside with their mallets. Others have ranged themselves in a semicircle outside with automatic pistols, and they point. To the left. That means that those on the left are in place, and those on the right must get over there on the jump like fleas, hopping over each other and landing where they can. And whoever isn't nimble, whoever gets caught daydreaming, gets whacked on the ribs and back with the mallets to give him more energy. And by this time the convoy jackboots are already trampling your pauper's pallet, and all your lousy duds are being thrown in every direction, and everywhere there are lights and hammering. Have you sawed through any place? No. Then the convoy guards stand in the middle and begin to shift you from left to right, counting first, second, third. It would be quite enough to count simply with a wave of the finger, But if that were done, it wouldn't be terrifying, and so it is more vivid, less subject to error, more energetic and faster. To beat out that count with the same mallet on your ribs, shoulders, heads, wherever it happens to land. They have counted up to 40, so now they will go about their tossing, lighting up, and hammering at the other end of the car. It's all over finally, and the car is locked up. You can go back to sleep till the next stop. And one can't really say that the anxiety of the convoy guard is entirely unfounded, because those who know how can escape from the red cattle cars. For instance, they knock on a board to test it and find it has been partially sawed through, or suddenly in the morning when the gruel is being distributed, they see that there are several shaved faces among the unshaven ones, and they surround the car with their automatic pistols. "Hand over your knives!" And this is really just petty bravado on the part of the thieves and their allies. They got tired of being unshaven, and now they're going to have to turn in their razor. The red train differs from other long-distance trains in that those who have embarked on it do not know whether or not they will disembark. When they unloaded a trainload from the Leningrad prisons, 1942, in Solikamsk, the entire embankment was covered with corpses, and only a few got there alive. In the winters of 1944 to 1945 and 1945 to 1946, in the village of Zheleznorodny, Kainaj Pogost, as in all the main rail junctions in the north, the prisoner trains from liberated territories, the Baltic states, Poland, Germany, arrived with 1 or 2 carloads of corpses tacked on behind. That meant that en route they had carefully taken the corpses out of the cars that contained the living passengers and put them in the dead cars, but not always. There were many occasions when they found out who was still alive and who was dead, only when they opened up the car after arriving at the Sukhobezvodnaya Unshlag station. Those who didn't come out were dead. It was terrifying and deadly to travel this way in winter because the convoy, with all its bother about security, wasn't able to haul coal for 25 stoves. But it wasn't so cushy to travel this way in hot weather either. 2 of the 4 tiny windows were tightly sealed, and the car roof would overheat, and the convoy wasn't about to exert itself in hauling water for 1,000 prisoners. After all, they couldn't even manage to give just 1 Stolypin car enough to drink. The prisoners considered April and September the best months for transports, but even the best of seasons was too short if the train was en route for 3 months, Leningrad to Vladivostok in 1935. And if such a long trip is in prospect, then arrangements have been made for both political indoctrination of the convoy soldiers and spiritual care of the imprisoned souls. In a separate railroad car attached to such a train travels a godfather, a security officer. He has made his preparations for the prisoner transport train back in prison, and prisoners are assigned to cars not simply at random, but according to lists he has validated. He is the one who appoints the monitor in each car and who has instructed and assigned a stool pigeon to each. At long stops, he finds some pretext for summoning both from the car and asks what the people are talking about in there. And any such security chief would be ashamed to finish the journey without signed and sealed results. And so, right there en route, he puts someone under interrogation, and lo and behold, by the time they reach their destination, the prisoner has been handed a new prison term. No, damn that red cattle car train, too, even though it did carry the prisoners straight to their destination without changing trains. Anyone who has ever been in one will never forget it. Just as well get to camp sooner, just as well arrive sooner. A human being is all hope and impatience, as if the security officer in camp will be any more humane or the stoolies any less unscrupulous. It's just the other way around, as if they won't force us to the ground with those same threats and those same police dogs when we arrive. Sit down. As if there will be less snow on the ground in camp than what has sifted through into the cattle cars. As if it means that we've already gotten to where we're going when they begin to unload us and won't be carried farther in open flat cars on a narrow-gauge track. And how can they carry us in open flat cars? How can we be kept under guard? That's a problem for the convoy. And here is how they do it. They order us to lie down, all huddled together, and they cover us with one big tarpaulin, like the sailors in the motion picture Potemkin before they're to be executed. And say thank you for the tarpaulin, too. In the north, in October, Olenev and his comrades had the luck to have to sit in open flat cars all day long. They had already embarked, but no locomotive had come. First it rained, then it froze, and the Zek's rags froze on them. The tiny train will jerk and toss as it moves, and the sides of the flat car will begin to crack and break, and the bouncing will hurl someone off the car and under the wheels. And here is a riddle. If one is traveling 60 miles from Dudinka through Arctic frost in open flat cars on the narrow-gauge track, then where are the thieves going to be? Answer, in the middle of each flat car, so the livestock around them will keep them warm and keep them from falling under the train themselves. Right answer. Question. What will the Zeks see at the end of this narrow-gauge track? 1939. Will there be any buildings there? No, not a one. Any dugouts? Yes, but already occupied, not for them. And does that mean that the first thing they do will be to dig themselves dugouts? No, because how can they dig in the Arctic winter? Instead, they will be sent out to mine metal. And where will they live? What? Live? Oh, yes, live. They will live in tents. But will there always be a narrow-gauge track? No, of course not. The train arrived, Yetsovo Station, February 1938. The railroad cars were opened up at night. Bonfires were lit alongside the train, and disembarkation took place by their light. Then a...
Alright, that's it for today. Please give follow if you don't mind.